Finally, I feel free from a heavy burden. Starting today, my parents will be living with me in my house. When my parents passed away, my husband, Calix, took an unexpected step. He demolished our family home. As we stood in front of the empty lot, he said something that left me shocked. "Hurry up and bring the inheritance to our place." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "What are you talking about? Have you completely lost your mind?" I asked, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. His words made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because I suddenly understood what was going on. Calix and his parents looked confused as I laughed. "Why are you laughing? Don't you understand?" he said, his tone sharp and impatient. I decided it was time to tell them the truth. "My name is Arden Jackson," I began, speaking calmly. "I was born the eldest daughter of parents who were just regular office workers. I have one younger brother, and we were a very ordinary family. Life was simple, but it was good." I explained how I had married Calix when I was 28 years old. We had 2 wonderful kids, a son named Kale and a daughter named Leora. Life had its challenges, but it was balanced. I worked while raising our kids, and before I knew it, I was 50 years old. My children were all grown up by then, living independently and building their own careers. It felt like the perfect time for Calix and me to relax and enjoy the next chapter of our lives. It was a peaceful and ordinary life, and I thought it would continue that way. But everything changed one winter day. My father was in a car accident and passed away suddenly. He was only 66 years old. Our family was overwhelmed with grief. It hit us hard, but it was especially devastating for my mother. She became so depressed that she couldn't even eat. "Mom, I know it's hard, but you have to eat something," I urged her, trying to help her cope. "I know," she replied weakly, "but I just don't have any appetite. It feels like there's a heavy weight in my chest." At first, my brother and I thought it was just her way of grieving. We gave her time, thinking she'd start to recover on her own. But she didn't. Within just 3 weeks, she had lost a shocking amount of weight. I became worried and decided to take her to the hospital for a checkup. The doctor's diagnosis was devastating: cancer. Not only that, but the cancer was already at an advanced stage. Surgery wasn't an option, and she was given about a year to live. I felt crushed. I had barely begun to process my father's death, and now I was losing my mother too. It was unbearable to think about. I hadn't even had the chance to properly take care of my parents yet, and now time was running out. But I couldn't afford to let grief consume me. I had to step up for my mother's sake. My brother lived far away and couldn't provide much help, so the responsibility fell on me. I told Calix that I wanted my mother to move in with us, so I could care for her during her illness. But Calix's reaction was far from supportive. "We just finished dealing with your dad's funeral," he said, clearly annoyed. "And now I'm supposed to deal with more of your family's problems?" "You don't have to say it like that," I replied, feeling hurt by his tone. "Can't you just drive her to her doctor's appointments?" "Do we really need to live with her?" he added, his frustration obvious. I tried to explain. "She's going to feel lonely, and I want to be there for her. If it's really a problem, I could stay at my parents' house for a while instead." But this suggestion only made Calix angrier. "And who's going to take care of me while you're gone? Who's going to cook my meals?
Who's going to do the laundry?" he demanded.
His reaction left me speechless. I wanted to help my mother during what little time she had left, but Calix made me feel like I was being selfish for even asking. I knew my mother, being kind and considerate, would probably insist that I not inconvenience Calix. But I couldn't just abandon her when she needed me most. Eventually, after a lot of arguing, Calix begrudgingly agreed. "Fine, but don't expect me to help with anything," he said. "Thank you," I replied, swallowing my frustration. I knew he wasn't being fair, but I was relieved that he had at least agreed to let her stay. So we moved into my family home to care for my mother. Calix and I had been living in a house provided by his employer, so we hadn't bought our own home yet. His parents had always planned for us to move in with them eventually, but for now, staying in my family's house was the best solution. It had more space, and we didn't have to pay the rent we were paying before. True to his word, Calix didn't lift a finger to help. He left everything to me, but I was grateful to have the chance to care for my mother during her final days. Although she seemed strong at times, she was often weak and spent much of her day lying down. I made her meals, fed her, and ensured she took her medication. She wouldn't have been able to manage it all on her own. "Thank you, Arden," she said to me one evening. "It's such a relief to have you here with me. And please thank Calix too. I'm so grateful to him for letting me stay." She didn't know how harsh Calix had been about the situation, and I didn't have the heart to tell her. One evening, after my mother had gone to bed, Calix came home from work. As we sat down for dinner, I brought up her treatment plan. But before I could say much, Calix cut me off with a glare. "I don't know what you expect me to say," he snapped. Calix's attitude left me feeling completely isolated. He had made it clear from the start, "I told you I'm not helping with anything." No matter how much I tried to talk to him, he refused to listen. All I wanted was someone to vent to, someone to lean on during such a hard time. I didn't even expect him to solve anything. Just listening would have been enough. But Calix wasn't interested. Months passed, and his behavior didn't improve. 2 months, 3 months, and still, he treated living with my mother as if it were some monumental sacrifice on his part. He constantly complained about the situation, acting as if he were doing me an enormous favor. His attitude wasn't just indifferent, it was downright obnoxious, and it grew worse by the day. Between worrying about my mother's health and trying to keep peace with Calix, I found myself under an unbearable amount of stress. Then, my mother's condition worsened rapidly, much faster than expected. Around the time we had feared the 3-year prognosis might be approaching, she had to be hospitalized. It was a heartbreaking time. Just 5 days later, she passed away. Even though I had prepared myself for this moment, it hit me harder than I imagined. I was devastated. Thankfully, my brother, his family, and my children came immediately to help with the funeral preparations. In moments like these, you want your spouse by your side, someone to lean on emotionally. But Calix? He was off in a corner, laughing and chatting with his parents as if it were any other day. He didn't help with the preparations at all, leaving the heavy lifting to my brother. Somehow, we managed to get everything organized for the funeral without him. During the ceremony, Calix's behavior became even more shocking. Instead of sitting in the family section where he belonged, he stayed in the back with the distant relatives. It was humiliating. "Calix, I want you to sit in the family section," I whispered to him. He shook his head. "No, I'm fine here. I'm not a blood relative, after all," he said casually, as if this was normal. I was stunned. "But you're my husband," I reminded him, trying to keep my voice calm. Before Calix could respond, his mother chimed in. "He may be your husband, but he's not your mother's son. Calix is our son, so he's technically an outsider too, you know. Arden should sit in the family section alone." Hearing her words felt like a slap in the face. I couldn't believe they were treating Calix, my husband, as if he had no connection to my family. In my hometown, it's common for sons-in-law to sit in the family section at funerals, but apparently, Calix and his family didn't share the same values. Their lack of respect left me speechless. To make things worse, distant relatives began whispering among themselves, wondering if Calix and I had secretly divorced. Despite my anger and embarrassment, I focused on saying goodbye to my mother. We managed to see her off peacefully, though Calix's absence by my side left a bitter feeling in my heart. After the funeral, everyone, my brother's family, my children, Calix, and his parents, returned to my family home. I served tea, trying to express my gratitude. "Thank you for coming, especially during such a busy time," I said politely. Instead of offering condolences, my in-laws laughed. "Well, it's been something, hasn't it? First your father, now your mother. These funeral expenses are such a burden. But at least it's all over now," they said, as if it were a joke. Their words stunned me. What did they mean by a burden? I felt my face flush with anger, but I forced a smile and excused myself to another room. As I stepped away, I overheard Calix talking with his parents. "It must have been tough for you, Calix, living with outsiders," his mother said sympathetically. "Yeah, dealing with Arden's whims was such a pain," Calix replied. "A husband shouldn't just follow his wife's demands. If you don't like something, you have every right to refuse." Hearing their laughter and casual tone made my blood boil. They had no idea what I had been going through, or maybe they just didn't care. Calix and his parents had always been rude and insensitive, but this was a new low. Even when we got married, Calix's mother had said, "Couldn't you find someone more attractive?" I guess I can't expect much from the grandchildren now. His father joked, "They say beauty gets boring after 3 days, but with Arden, you won't get bored." And Calix had just laughed along with them. Now, as I stood listening to their conversation, I realized they hadn't offered a single kind word after either of my parents' deaths. Instead, they had mocked and ridiculed me. For so long, I had felt guilty about burdening Calix with my family's issues, but now I saw his behavior for what it truly was: cruel and selfish. As I tried to calm myself down, my mother-in-law suddenly called out, "Arden?" "Yes," I replied, startled. She was holding my late mother's purse. "Can I have this?" she asked casually. I was too shocked to respond at first.
"What?"
I stammered. "Well, your mother doesn't need it anymore, right?"
Calix suggested I take it.
"Maybe I'll just keep it," she said, inspecting the purse as if she were shopping in a store. I couldn't believe her audacity. Still, I managed to compose myself and said firmly, "No, you can't have it." Her expression changed instantly. She wasn't upset about the purse itself. She was furious that I, her daughter-in-law, had dared to stand up to her. But I stood my ground. "We're not ready to sort through my mother's belongings yet. When the time comes, we'll distribute her keepsakes among the family," I said. Her face turned red with anger. "What do you mean? Are you saying I'm an outsider?" she snapped. I looked her straight in the eye. "You're the one who said at the funeral that Calix was an outsider to my mother. So yes, by that logic, you're an outsider too?" Hearing this, Calix and his father also turned red with anger. "How dare you talk to Mom like that? Apologize right now," Calix demanded. Their shouting drew everyone from the other room. My mother-in-law, now furious, shouted dramatically, "I didn't expect to be called an outsider after all the effort we put into attending this funeral. Let's go home, Dad." She stormed out, and Calix followed her without saying another word. After they left, my family, confused by the commotion, asked, "What happened? Did you really call your mother-in-law an outsider?" I explained everything that had happened. Once they understood the full story, not a single person blamed me. Even my children sided with me. "Grandma and Grandpa should be more considerate of other people's feelings," they said. "That's just how Dad, Grandma, and Grandpa have always been." Their support gave me strength, but deep down, I knew this was just the beginning of a much bigger problem. I couldn't shake the betrayal I felt from Calix and his parents. Since that awful day, Calix hadn't come home, and I hadn't reached out to him either. I didn't feel like I should be the one to apologize, and honestly, I didn't know if I could ever forgive him, even if he did apologize. But I knew we couldn't go on like this forever. Then one day, Calix returned unexpectedly. "Welcome home," I said, forcing myself to stay calm despite the anger bubbling inside me at the sight of him. "It's been tough, huh?" he said, his tone gruff and awkward, as if he were trying to sound concerned. His words caught me off guard. Before I could respond, he handed me some travel vouchers. "Take the kids and go on a trip. A change of scenery will do you good," he said. I was speechless. Tears welled up in my eyes. I wasn't sure if this was his way of trying to make amends or if it had been the kids' idea, but it touched me that Calix went along with it. Without a word, I took the vouchers and thanked him. Later, I called my children to plan the trip. "Really? Dad suggested this?" Leora asked, her voice full of surprise. "Yeah, he did," I replied. "It's surprising, isn't it?" "It really is," she said. The kids seemed just as astonished as I was, but they were excited about the idea. It seemed like Calix had genuinely meant this as a kind gesture, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope. I packed my bags, ready for a little escape. "I'll be off then," I said to Calix as I prepared to leave. "Take your time," he replied. "Stay with the kids at their places too, if you want." "Really? I can't be away that long," I said, feeling unsure.
"Don't worry about me.
"I'll relax at my parents' place." Just enjoy yourself, he insisted. With that, I left for my trip. First, I visited Leora, who was thrilled to have me. Then, I stopped by my son Kale's place. I hadn't had the chance to visit them during the past couple of years while caring for my mother, so this time was special. I helped both of them by cooking and freezing meals, which they greatly appreciated. Mom, you should be relaxing, not working, Kale said, laughing. But this really helps. It's no trouble, I replied, feeling happy to do something for my kids. Finally, the day of the spa trip arrived. My children and I spent a few days at the hot springs, enjoying the peaceful surroundings. The time together helped me heal, both physically and emotionally. For the first time in a long while, I felt the heavy weight of caregiving and grief begin to lift. This was so much fun, Kale said as we wrapped up the trip. We should thank Dad for this. Just this once, Leora added with a smile. I agree. It was thoughtful of him, I said, feeling a small glimmer of gratitude. When I returned home, I was ready to share the happy memories with Calix and start fresh as a couple. But what I saw left me speechless. The house, my family home, was gone. I stood frozen, staring at the empty lot where the house should have been. I recognized the location, but everything else was unrecognizable. The home I had grown up in, full of memories of my parents, was no longer there. My heart pounded in disbelief. Then, out of nowhere, Calix appeared, flanked by his parents. They were grinning, looking oddly pleased with themselves. Calix, what's going on? I asked, trying to stay calm. Calix's sickening smile deepened. Finally, I'm rid of that burden. Starting today, my parents are moving in with me here, he said, gesturing at the empty lot. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice trembling. Have you lost your mind? Calix's father added smugly, your family home has been demolished. Now bring over the inheritance. Whatever you've inherited, it's Calix's now. It was then that I realized the horrifying truth. Calix and his parents had demolished the house, assuming there was a substantial inheritance waiting for them. Anger and sadness overwhelmed me, but I refused to let them see me cry. Instead, I burst into laughter. The absurdity of their greed and betrayal made me laugh uncontrollably. What's so funny? Calix demanded, his grin fading. She's lost it, Calix's mother muttered, looking at me as if I were crazy. Through my laughter, I finally managed to say, there's no inheritance. Not a single penny. You destroyed my family's home for nothing. Their faces froze in shock. What do you mean? Calix demanded, his voice rising. I didn't bother explaining further. Instead, I turned to leave. I'm not living with strangers. If you want to live together, you can do it without me, I said firmly. Calix's mother exploded in anger. You helped with your parents' housework, but you won't help us? How dare you? You wanted to avoid housework, and you thought demolishing the house would solve your problems. There are things you just don't do, I said, raising my voice for the first time. Without waiting for a response, I walked away. Where are you going? Calix shouted after me, but I didn't look back. I needed time to think and a place to stay for the night, anywhere but near Calix and his parents. That night, I consulted a lawyer. Demolishing a house couldn't be done so easily, especially when it was still under my mother's name. As I explained the situation, I learned an unbelievable truth. Calix and his father had demolished the house themselves. His father, who worked in demolition, had enlisted his acquaintances to carry out the plan. They had even rented heavy machinery to do the job. The travel vouchers? A calculated move to get me out of the way while they carried out their scheme. Tears streamed down my face as I realized how deeply I had been betrayed. But the lawyer reassured me. Calix unlawfully demolished a property that wasn't in his name. He can be charged with property destruction and held liable for damages. Let's start by demanding a formal apology from him and his parents, the lawyer said with a kind smile. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. I had been wronged, but I wasn't powerless. Calix and his parents would face the consequences of their actions, and I was determined to reclaim my life. The lawyer quickly took action after I agreed to move forward, sending Calix a legal notice for compensation. Just a few days later, I got a call from him, furious. "What's with this certified letter?" he yelled. "Oh, you got it," I replied calmly. "You destroyed my family's house, so of course, you have to compensate me." "Compensate? Are you serious?" "We said we were moving to my parents' place. I demolished a house that no one was living in. You should be thanking me, not demanding compensation. Now bring the inheritance and come back home," Calix said arrogantly, his tone dripping with entitlement. "Thank you for demolishing my house? Don't make me laugh."
And what inheritance?
"It's not even settled yet," I shouted back, unable to hold in my anger. Calix went silent for a moment, clearly startled by my outburst. I rarely raised my voice, and this was probably the first time he'd seen this side of me. The truth was, I had already decided what to do about the inheritance long before any of this. During the year I spent with my mother, we had discussed it together. I told my brother that I didn't want anything and asked him to take it all. In the end, he inherited all the cash and stocks. However, he insisted I take the house, knowing I was the only one who could manage it since he lived far away. We had planned to keep it in the family, either for me to live in or to rent out. But Calix had ruined that. "Here's what's going to happen," I told him. "Either you and your father restore the house to its original state, or you pay the amount specified in the legal notice. I was trying to settle this peacefully, but if you don't comply, I'll file a police report and sue you."
Calix panicked.
"I'm sorry. I didn't think you'd get so upset," he said, trying to excuse his behavior. "Of course, I'm angry. What did you expect?" I snapped. His excuses didn't matter to me anymore. I later learned from conversations with Calix's family what had driven him to this. His father had always wanted Calix and me to live with them, particularly because he had a soft spot for our son, Kale. But Calix had always refused, using his difficult commute as an excuse. His parents assumed I was the one against the idea, so to convince them otherwise, Calix hatched this plan. He demolished my family's house, hoping I would have no choice but to move in with his parents under the pretense of using my inheritance. It was manipulative and cruel. "I didn't mean any harm," Calix pleaded. "Please give me a break. Dad's sorry too." "If you're truly sorry, then agree to the settlement," I replied coldly and hung up. Calix kept calling and texting, apologizing repeatedly, but I refused to entertain him. "If you're sorry, just transfer the money," I messaged back. My childhood home could never be restored, but at least I could try to find some closure by holding him accountable. During this time, I stayed at Leora's place, trying to figure out my next steps. My brother and children were fully supportive. Although my brother was furious about the house being demolished without his consent, he chose to stay out of the legal battle, saying, "I won't interfere, but I'll help you in any way I can. Do what you think is best, Arden." Everyone condemned Calix's actions, which gave me the strength to keep pushing forward. A month passed, and Calix still hadn't paid any compensation. He had also stopped contacting me altogether. I couldn't stay with Leora forever, and I was anxious to resolve this quickly so I could start rebuilding my life. But then something shocking happened, something I could have never imagined. One day, Leora called out to me, holding up her phone. "Mom, doesn't this apron look like Grandma's?" she asked, showing me a listing on a flea market app. I froze when I saw it. The apron was unique. It was one I had made for my mother years ago.
"What?"
"That's Grandma's apron," I exclaimed. "I made it, so I'm sure of it." Alarmed, Leora scrolled through the seller's listings. The profile was new, with no reviews or previous transactions, but it had nearly 45 items for sale. To my horror, all of them were my mother's belongings. Dresses, jewelry, trinkets, and even her favorite kitchen utensils, all things that had been in the house before it was demolished. My heart sank. There was only one person who could have taken those items after the house was destroyed, Calix. Furious, I immediately called him. "What's this about the app?" I demanded. "App? What are you talking about?" Calix replied, sounding annoyed. "Don't play dumb. You're selling my mother's belongings without permission, aren't you? Cancel those listings right now," I shouted. Calix stammered, trying to come up with an excuse. I don't know what you're talking about. You think I'm stupid? Stop this immediately, or you'll regret it, I warned. My hands trembled as I ended the call. I couldn't believe how far Calix had gone, and I wasn't going to let him get away with this after receiving the shocking call from Calix. I couldn't waste any time. What do you mean it wasn't you? I demanded. Who else would sell my mother's belongings? I was furious, and he sounded panicked. It really wasn't me, Calix stammered. Then who? I'm coming over right now to get everything back, I said and hung up. Without hesitation, Leora and I headed straight to Calix's parents' house. As soon as we arrived, I confronted Calix at the door. Where are my mother's things? I demanded, glaring at him. I don't know anything about it, he stuttered, looking visibly uncomfortable. Tell the truth, Dad, Leora chimed in, her voice sharp. Calix looked flustered, but before he could respond, his parents appeared. Oh, Leora, you're here, Calix's mom said cheerfully, smiling as she noticed her granddaughter. Leora didn't waste any time. Grandma, tell Dad to tell the truth. What happened to Grandma's belongings? She demanded, her voice trembling with anger. At Leora's words, Calix's mom burst into laughter. Calix is selling them? That's impossible, she exclaimed. Then, with a casual wave of her hand, she added, I'm the one selling them.
Her words sent a chill through me.
My blood ran cold, and I froze in disbelief. Calix's face turned pale, and his expression revealed that he had known about this all along. Leora's shock mirrored mine, but his mother continued talking, seemingly unaware of the gravity of her actions. What's the big deal? She said nonchalantly. It's a lot of work, you know. I have to pack everything carefully and make sure the photos look good. It keeps me busy. She sounded almost proud of herself, chatting as if this were a normal hobby. Cancel the listings right now. Those aren't yours to sell, Leora yelled, tears streaming down her face. But her grandmother seemed annoyed rather than remorseful. What's the problem? I finally found a hobby I enjoy. Selling these things keeps my mind active. It's good for preventing dementia. Besides, I'm the only grandmother left, and Leora wants me to stay healthy and live long, right? She said smugly. Her audacity was infuriating, and it became clear that pleading with her wouldn't change anything. She didn't care about the emotional value of those belongings or the pain she was causing. Let's go, Leora, I said firmly, pulling her away. But, Mom, this isn't fair, Leora protested. I know, but this isn't something we can solve here. Let's go to the police, I replied, determined. At the police station, I explained the situation, that my mother's belongings were stolen and were being sold without permission. The officers acted swiftly, suspending Calix's mother's account on the flea market app. This ensured that the items couldn't be sold anymore. As we left the station, I called Calix. I had your mother's account suspended. You knew about it, didn't you? That makes you complicit, I accused.
No. I didn't know she was doing that.
Calix stammered, sounding frantic. I've already filed a police report, so you better cooperate with the investigation, I warned.
What?
We're family. Withdraw it, please. Calix begged. Family? You still haven't paid a dime in compensation for the house, nor have you shown any remorse. Don't talk to me about family, I snapped. His pleas fell on deaf ears. Despite my anger, I still felt conflicted. I had lived with Calix for so many years, and part of me still had lingering feelings for him. Sighing, I softened slightly. I'll wait for the money, but I won't forgive the theft. Return everything. And, by the way, your father doesn't look well. Has he seen a doctor?
What?
Calix asked, sounding surprised. I'm not a monster, Calix. I just thought you should know, I said before hanging up. Calix's father had looked alarmingly thin and sickly when I saw him earlier. His complexion was unnatural, and it was obvious that something was wrong. But his family seemed too self-absorbed to notice. A few days later, I received a shocking call from Calix's father himself. What do you mean by treating me like a sick person? Are you planning to dump me in a hospital and get rid of me? He snapped. I was just concerned about your health, I replied, trying to keep calm. Don't make a fool of me. I'm not frail or short-lived like your parents, he retorted harshly. His words infuriated me, but I let it go. Not long after, he did end up visiting a doctor and was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Calix called me, panicked. Dad's got terminal cancer. What am I supposed to do? He cried. I couldn't help but scoff. I don't know, Calix. When I suggested he go to the hospital, he told me he wasn't frail or short-lived like my parents. So deal with it yourself, I replied coldly. How can you be so heartless, Arden? Calix said, sounding hurt. Heartless? Did you ever show my mother or me any kindness when we were going through the same thing? Reflect on your own actions, I said before hanging up. Calix's father passed away soon after. While I didn't want to harbor negative feelings towards someone who had died, I couldn't shed a single tear. The years of cruelty and hurt couldn't be erased. After the funeral, we discovered his will. Surprisingly, he had left their family house to Kale, my son. It seemed Calix's father had always favored Kale and wanted him to inherit the home, even after his death. Though Kale was excited, I told him, "You don't need that house. Renounce the inheritance. It'll only bring trouble." But Kale insisted on keeping it. Grandpa wanted me to have it, he said, happy with the decision. The inheritance taxes were significant, but Calix's mother paid them, declaring, "He's our successor, after all." It was bittersweet, as if Kale had been taken from me in some way. Then came the ultimate twist. One day, Calix called me in a panic. "Come over to the house right now," he shouted. When I arrived, I was stunned to see heavy machinery and trucks from a demolition company tearing down Calix's parents' house. Kale stood nearby, watching with a satisfied expression. "Kale, what's going on?" Calix yelled. "Stop this. This is our house. It's my house now. Grandpa left it to me, remember? I can do what I want with it," Kale replied calmly. Calix and his mother fell to their knees, begging Kale to stop. But he simply laughed. "Did you forget what Grandpa and Dad did to Mom? Grandma, you treated Mom horribly, too. Did you ever apologize?" he said, his sharp glare silencing them. As the house was demolished, I finally felt a sense of closure. Later, Calix paid the damages and compensation with the remaining inheritance. Kale also retrieved all the stolen belongings and returned them to me. "You always have me and Leora," Kale said gently, and I finally let myself cry, this time with relief. Calix and his mother moved back into company housing, becoming the subject of rumors. Their future was uncertain, but I didn't concern myself with them anymore. I focused on moving forward. Kale got engaged and invited me to live with him and his fiancée. "Mom, come live with us," he offered. His fiancée welcomed me warmly, and I decided to accept, determined to enjoy this new chapter of my life. I resolved never to become a mother-in-law like Calix's mother and to live happily with my new family.
Your valley is so huge you don't turn me on anymore. Raise the kids yourself. Looking at my pregnant belly, James made a shocking remark, giving an unreasonable reason for divorce. I felt abandoned, as if left on the streets. However, a miracle happened to me. Fine, here are the divorce papers. I had a good reason to accept the divorce. 3 months later, I received frantic calls from him. "My name is Catherine, just an ordinary office worker. My life had never been extraordinary. Now, it feels like I am at a peak. Catherine, will you support me? I married James, my boss, who worked in sales at a major general trading company. We began dating when I was 27. At first, I just saw him as a reliable senior at work and didn't pay him any special attention. But after attending a drinking party with him, I quickly realized he was dependable. He was considerate and respected by others, passionate about his work, and I was amazed by his sales techniques. Although I could be considerate, I was very bad at expressing my opinions. It took me several years to be able to speak my mind. James passionately coached me, and I naturally became attracted to his enthusiasm. Perhaps he noticed my feelings because he started to approach me more frequently. Right after he was promoted to section chief, we began our relationship. A year into our relationship, he proposed to me. Today, we finally made it to the finish line. Honestly, I felt elated, as if I was ascending to heaven. This was probably the first time I felt so overjoyed. Having had no romantic experiences, let alone serious relationships with men, I thought falling in love with James was pure destiny. That is, until things took a turn for the worse. A year after marrying James, I was carrying a new life inside me. I left the hospital excited, wondering how James would react. But when I told him about the pregnancy, his response was devastatingly unexpected. "You're pregnant." He showed utter inconvenience, perfectly mirroring his words. "Didn't you marry me to support my life? Weren't you on birth control pills?" I was shocked. As we were building our life after marriage, I had always wanted children. I thought James would be just as happy, but the reality was the exact opposite. James never wanted kids. He saw me as a housemate. I realized this during our discussion about my pregnancy. "Birth control? You never mentioned anything about birth control." His words were too cruel. I couldn't help but become emotional and snapped back. At that moment, a heavy sigh escaped from James' lips. "You just don't get it. You were trash, you used to work for me, and can't even assume that doing what's not being taught is basic. Is your brain too hollow to understand that?" Saying this, he tapped my head with his index finger. The force and emphasis of his words made me feel his frustration and disgust. I was supposed to be happy about this news. Why did he even marry me? As I thought this, he revealed another shocking truth. "I thought you could at least handle the household chores when I married you. I might consider getting a divorce." His words, which felt almost like a threat, depleted my heart. Overwhelmed by sadness and unable to speak, James, with a smirk, added, "Before I married you, I was actually thinking of hiring a maid. I really hate doing household chores, but you liked me, didn't you? You never went against my opinions, and I heard you were good at household tasks. I thought it would be a win-win situation for both of us. It seems like you fooled me." His unbelievable words made me sadder than angry. Fearful of showing my tears, I bit my lip, trying to distract myself with the pain. "I never wanted a child with you. Who asked for you to get pregnant? You should have taken birth control as you were told. That's on you." My heart was filled with regret for marrying him. Of course, he later demanded that I get an abortion, but I firmly refused that request. Until I could find a way to support myself, I had no choice but to do as he said. I begged him, pressing my head to the ground, pleading for the sake of the child. As a result, I remained by his side, but only as a housemate. I was his wife in name only. In exchange for not being involved as a couple, I was allowed to give birth to the child. "I'll provide money, but I won't take care of the kid at all. You're on your own with that." His words, as if he was pushing the responsibility of a pet onto me, pierced through my heart. I had quit my job when I married him because of his requests. If I returned to my previous job, I would have to see James every day after our divorce, and I absolutely couldn't stand that. Until I found a new job and secured a stable income, I had to endure this life. With those thoughts, I felt despair every day. "If you take care of the house properly, I'll work outside. All you need to do is be thorough with the household chores." I was aware that he was bad at household chores even when we were dating. I naively thought he was relying on me. Perhaps this was one of the reasons he wanted to marry me. No matter how much emotional abuse I endured from him, I couldn't escape him, especially now that we had a child. Leaving him, who had an above-average income, would mean plunging into poverty. Which is better, to have a child live in poverty or live in a house with no love? When faced with this harsh binary choice, another tragedy befell me. It was the news of my parents' death. After getting married, I could only see my parents about once a year. The only time I was allowed to return home was during the 3 days he was away on a business trip. "If you leave the house, what am I supposed to eat?" I couldn't just leave him food. He said such self-centered things. Hence, those rare trips home were the few pleasures in my life, a reward for my daily hard work. I was planning to report about my child as the only filial duty I could offer, but even that was taken away from me. I felt like I had hit rock bottom in my life. A while later, I received an email. I didn't recognize the sender, and feeling a bit uneasy, I opened it to find its shocking content. "If you read this letter, please contact me anytime." Along with the message was the sender's phone number and a photo. Seeing that picture made me believe the content of the letter was true. I immediately called the number written in the letter while crying. I explained everything and decided to meet them. "You want to see your relatives with your status as a housemate. How can you be so selfish? What about my meals during that time? Please, I need to deal with my parents' affairs and go through the procedures. I haven't even properly informed them about our child. They are asking to see me just this once." I don't have money to fund your outings. If you go, pay with your own money. I was constantly bombarded with cold, hurtful words. However, they no longer had the power to hurt me. My heart had become so numb that I could simply ignore his words. But for some reason, James, who was usually so harsh, suddenly brightened up as if he had an idea. Wait a second. I just remembered I have a business trip. You can go home for about 3 days, just come back before I return. That was unusual. It was unlike James to give me such freedom, but the reason for this sudden leniency would become clear later on. Having received James' permission, I returned to my hometown and met the sender of the letter. It was my maternal grandparents on my mother's side. My grandfather was American and my grandmother was Japanese. My mother spent her early years in America, but with an interest in Japanese culture, she came to Japan to study during her college years. That's where she met my father and got married. However, their marriage was not easily accepted. My grandparents strongly wished for her to stay in America and were against the marriage. The two eloped and couldn't even come to Japan until they heard the sad news of the passing of both. To be honest, we had forgiven them a long time ago, but we didn't know how to face them. I really regret being such a stubborn fool. If I had known this would happen, I would have welcomed their marriage. Upon hearing of their death from an acquaintance, the two were filled with sorrow and seemed to regret their actions. They blamed themselves for their passing. While I was lost in these thoughts, it seemed that the same acquaintance told them about me, their grandchild. They were worried about how I was doing and had also heard that I was pregnant. It might be hard for you to accept us considering what we did to your parents, but please understand we are always on your side. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask. I promise to protect you no matter what. If things get tough, don't ever think you're alone, okay? You can always depend on us. Without hesitation, tears welled up in my eyes as my grandmother, Eleanor, softly held my hand. Her warmth was comforting. After struggling for so long to protect the child in my belly, their warmth revived the numb feeling in my heart. Seeing me sob like this, my grandparents were both surprised and gentle, inquiring with concern about what had happened. When they learned of my current situation, they were furious and entrusted me with something. You don't have to endure such a life anymore. We will help you. Please let us. All you need to think about is yourself and the baby. Don't worry about finances. Take care of yourself. Encouraged by their supportive words, I decided to get a divorce. I had to exact revenge on my husband. However, before I could act, it was James who made the first move. As soon as I returned to our house, an enraged James confronted me with a letter from my grandparents. What is this letter? You went through my desk without permission. It's my house. I can do whatever I want. Even if it's your own house, there's something called privacy. What's with you today? You seem different talking back to me like that. I truly believed his ability to detect even the slightest change in me was remarkable. However, even if he read the letter, it wasn't a big deal. The letter only mentioned the existence of my grandparents, and there wasn't any particular issue with it. Yet James used that letter as a reason to suggest divorce. I bet you lied about meeting this old geezer and old lady in the letter. You went back to your hometown to date some guy, didn't you? What? Don't think you can fool me with such an obvious lie. I know you've been using the internet or some trick to have fun behind my back. You're a cheater. Wait a minute, how did you come to that conclusion? You know best that I don't have time for such things, don't you? I couldn't comprehend his absurd insinuations. My stomach hurt and I had a headache. It was just too much. You've never done anything like that before. Do you think you can deceive me with such an obvious lie? Don't underestimate me. He wasn't listening at all. I felt a sense of discomfort towards James, who was trying to trap me with such an excessively forced excuse. I'm disappointed in you. Not that I had much expectation to begin with. So what? Normally, at this point, one would present evidence of their innocence, proving that what James was saying was absurd. However, as I was contemplating divorce, I thought differently. I deliberately let James continue, wanting him to utter the next words. Let's get a divorce. Our marriage was basically out of mutual interest anyway. You've grown fat and unattractive. Raise the kid yourself. I don't want anything to do with you anymore. He got exactly what he wanted. I pulled out the divorce papers he had left and presented them to James. Great, here are the divorce papers. Sign them and I'll take them tomorrow before you change your mind. Why do you have this? I'm your housekeeper. Cleaning the house and finding something like this is a piece of cake. That's a lie. The truth is, I had noticed the divorce papers he left on his desk as a threat a long time ago. He slyly conveyed that he could dispose of me anytime, making sure I lived in fear of him so I wouldn't retaliate. I lived every day in fear of that single piece of paper. You're quite confident all of a sudden. Can you, with zero life skills, really survive without me? Don't underestimate me. I won't rely on someone like you anymore. I will protect my child with my own strength. In reality, it was a gamble. I was anxious inside, wondering what would happen if James suspected my sudden boldness. However, I had a hunch about why James proposed the divorce at this time. Therefore, I knew that he would not retract his divorce proposal and that this situation was also favorable for him. Oh, really? Then raise that kid on your own. Since we're divorcing on mutual terms, I won't have any involvement with you or the child. That kid isn't mine, and you don't ever come in contact with me. Promise? Fine, this is goodbye. Thus, when I was about 9 months pregnant, our marriage ended. I divorced James. With some savings from when I was single, I could quickly pack my belongings and leave this house. As planned, I headed to my grandparents' place and settled some matters there. Later, I gave birth to a healthy baby boy. I named him with hopes for his strong and resilient growth. My son grew up so fast, and my grandparents and I enjoyed watching him grow, living fulfilling days. 3 months later, I received a call from an unknown number. As I picked up the call, my expression turned sour. What the hell is going on? Explain. His shaking voice was so high-pitched I almost wanted to retort. Initially, I thought it was a woman calling me. I instinctively pulled the receiver away from my ear. The discomfort grew just hearing that voice, a chill going inside my head. I wanted to end the call immediately, yet as I continued to listen, he rattled on. You established a company. I never heard of this. Where in our marriage did you stash away that kind of money? That money is mine. Return it right now, you deceitful woman. Obviously, the voice belonged to James, who had somehow learned about my new company. Do you think someone's using your money? He started berating me, hurling accusations at me like a debt collector. I let out a sigh of disbelief at James' accusations, but I replied with utter calm. On what basis are you calling this a scam? There's no evidence that I stole your money. Shut up, you conniving. You probably took extra living expenses from me and secretly saved it. Even if that were true, there's no way I could have saved enough to start a company. The living expenses you gave me barely covered a month's worth. Don't be ridiculous. Then how did you get so much money? There's no job that would have given you such an income when you were unemployed and living with me. You just didn't know I had assets worth $1.1 million right before our divorce. What? $1.1 million. James's voice rose in surprise, stunned by the revelation. He choked on his words. How did you get that much money? The elderly couple I talked about are my maternal grandparents. They are the chairpersons of a globally renowned computer software company. Before divorcing you, I met them and received a bank book they had been saving for me. They always set money aside for their future granddaughter. What? He must have been completely taken aback. It was easy to imagine him being utterly astonished. Right after the divorce, I immediately proceeded with changing the account's name. My grandparents, who live in a distant country, have limited time when they come to my country. There was a need to hurry for smooth processing. Thankfully, the name change was completed the day they arrived in Japan, and I was able to access the money. My mom told me that my grandparents passed away when I was little. I didn't know that they had been estranged. When they found out about my situation, they decided to support me. They promised to take care of me. Upon learning the truth behind our divorce, James was furious. He started spouting words that made him seem hypocritical, given that he was the one who had rashly decided on the divorce. If I had known that, I wouldn't have divorced you. You have some nerve. You never tried to understand my situation. That's because you're terrible at explaining things. Is that why you're constantly fighting with your new wife, trying to shift the blame as always? How? How do you know that? Probably not expecting that I knew about his personal matters, James seemed lost for words. His frantic reaction was rather amusing. I wouldn't notice. It's obvious. We worked together. I didn't need to dig for information. The secret came to me. But don't worry, I'm genuinely relieved that you are marrying the boss's daughter. There's no chance of us getting back together, and I don't have to deal with you anymore. You don't have to be so harsh. We used to love each other. We can still reconcile, can't we? What? What are you talking about? I responded coldly, not even trying to comprehend what he meant. He seemed taken aback by the lack of warmth in my words. James remained silent, struggling to find the right words. Who said I want to get back together with you? I felt relieved after our divorce. I have a child now, and my grandparents have been so kind. I finally found my happiness. Let your wife deal with your nonsense. I don't want anything to do with you. Having regained my emotions, I recalled the painful days with James, and the anger I had suppressed exploded towards him. Hearing my words, James flinched, probably realizing that I had lost all affection for him. However, he started offering different terms. Well, can you give me some money then? She's incredibly high maintenance, and I barely have any spending money left. She's demanding, selfish, can't do housework properly, and she goes out almost every night. You have $1 million, right? Can you spare me some? Don't be ridiculous. I don't have a single penny left for you. Stop saying such things for your convenience. James, choked by my statement, let out a surprised exclamation. What? I use all the money to establish my company and buy a new house. I don't have $1.1 million left. I'm sorry for nothing. I had expected James to find out about my situation somehow, and considering his greedy nature, it was predictable that he'd come asking for money. That's why I thought of converting my money into fixed assets. So, I quickly bought a new house, used most of the funds to establish a nursing facility with a nursery, and spent the rest on the house. Thanks to this move, the facility is quite popular. It's loved by mothers in the same situation as me. It's fully equipped and designed to ensure single mothers can live independently. I got advice for the company's website and systems for my grandparents and did a lot of research myself using social media. I thoroughly researched what single parents want in a workplace, what kind of jobs are in demand, and established my own company to fulfill all these needs. I can't believe you're running such a successful business, James stammered. I was always so irritated by your condescending attitude. Now I can tell you, you thought you could do anything and saw me as trash, but you were so wrong. I hope you regret leaving me for the rest of your life. Your regret won't change anything. Wait, Catherine. Please give us another chance. I'll do anything you want. Neil, clean your house, anything. You must be joking. I would never get back with you even if it killed me. Live happily with your current wife and please never tell my son you're his father. After that, it seemed like he was shouting something, but I unceremoniously ended the call. I blocked his contact and changed my number. When I told my grandparents about the contact from James, they arranged everything from security cameras at my home, ensuring he couldn't approach me. If you want, we can even get you a bodyguard, they offered, showing an overly protective stance which made me smile with appreciation and a bit of embarrassment. Since then, James has been struggling in his married life with the CEO's daughter. It's sad that he's being dominated and drained of his own salary. Every time I hear stories about him from my former colleagues, it feels like whiskey tastes better. Colleagues who heard the story from me began to disdain him, and it became evident to others as well. Eventually, James earned a reputation at work as the unfaithful man. As a result, his standing in the company plummeted. It's said he's continuing his job under much stress and constraint. He is the husband of the CEO's daughter after all. He's probably living the hellish life, unable to resign even if he wants to. Colleagues would joke, and I'd join in the laughter in agreement. Thus, I finally regained a peaceful life. My son, showered with love from his great-grandparents, is growing up healthily. It's almost 10 years since he was born, and I've taught him everything about James without hiding any details. I won't become a man like that. Don't worry, I'll always protect you, Mom, he'd say, making me swoon with his prince-like words every day.
While I was busy at work, an unexpected email interrupted my day. It was from my husband Jack, who calmly confessed over the phone that he had fallen in love with someone else and was planning to start a new life with her. Shockingly, he also mentioned his intention to take the luxury camper van that we had recently bought, a purchase made in my name through a loan. Despite my efforts to reason with him, Jack disregarded my pleas, abruptly ended the conversation, and soon became unreachable. Eventually, he vanished with his new partner, leaving me and our 12-year-old son, Gary, burdened with a significant debt. My name is Lauren, a 40-year-old mother, navigating through life with Gary, a remarkably bright child who loves to read and discuss complex topics. Unlike Gary, Jack has always been unpredictable, rarely holding on to a job for long. Despite these challenges, he managed to keep a stable income for the past 4 years, which brought a sense of relief to our family's financial stability. Our family, despite its imperfections, had moments of joy and dreams of making lasting memories together. One of these dreams involved purchasing a $55,000 camper van to explore and create adventures as a family. Unfortunately, due to Jack's poor credit history, I had to secure the loan for the van under my name. The day we were supposed to celebrate the van's arrival, I was blindsided by Jack's email, in which he claimed the van for himself, citing the loan was in my name and I would be responsible for its repayments. This abrupt revelation, followed by his confession of love for another woman, left me in a state of shock and uncertainty. At 40, with a son to raise and a sudden financial burden, I found myself pondering our future, unsure of the next steps to take in this unexpected turn of events. What started as a fleeting connection unexpectedly grew serious, prompting Jack to declare his intentions to start anew with someone else and leave our shared life behind. During a brief and unsettling phone call, he referenced our previous discussions about divorce conversations that emerged during heated arguments. Jack stated he would proceed with the divorce, swiftly ending the conversation and leaving me in a state of shock. This moment was the stark realization of Jack's betrayal, a harsh revelation that hit me deeply. Despite my attempts to reach out to him following this exchange, he remained silent, never responding to my calls or emails. Upon returning home one day, I discovered the drawer where we kept important documents, including our discussed divorce papers, was empty. Jack had taken them. This left me facing the immense financial strain of a $55,000 car loan we had taken together. Amidst this turmoil, my son Gary noticed my distress. His worry became evident one evening when he approached me, his voice laced with concern, asking if I was okay, noting my lack of appetite and the unusual atmosphere at home. Caught off guard by his perceptiveness, I realized I could no longer shield him from the truth. Hesitantly, I opened up to Gary, sharing the painful details of what had transpired. His response was surprisingly mature. He seemed to have anticipated the changes in our family dynamics, although I sensed the news affected him more than he let on. Inwardly, I apologized to him, feeling a profound sadness for the upheaval in his young life. As the days passed, the weight of the situation took a toll on me, both emotionally and physically. My health began to decline, a fact I could no longer ignore when I found myself unable to stand during a training session at work. Despite my attempts to reassure my colleagues, I collapsed, my body succumbing to the overwhelming stress. When I awoke, I was in a hospital room, a stark reminder of the toll the ordeal had taken on me. Amidst the physical and emotional chaos, the support from those around me, especially Gary, became a beacon of strength, reminding me of the resilience needed to navigate through the aftermath of Jack's departure and the challenges that lay ahead. After receiving a concerning diagnosis from the doctor, I was admitted to the hospital for further tests. There, lying in the hospital bed, hooked up to an IV drip and staring at the stark white ceiling, I couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the situation. It was supposed to be stress from emotional turmoil, yet there I was, feeling utterly defeated. As tears began to flow, my son Gary, who usually maintains his composure, burst into the room, his face etched with worry. His sudden appearance prompted me to quickly dry my eyes. "Mom, what's going on? It's not serious, is it? You're not going to leave me, are you?" he asked, his voice laced with fear. "Of course not, sweetheart. I could never leave you," I reassured him, attempting to mask my own fears. Gary explained how he had been notified by his school teacher about my hospitalization, how shocked and scared he had been. Despite his maturity, he was still just a 12-year-old boy, a realization that steeled my resolve to recover. However, my health situation was more grave than I initially thought. Diagnosed with a serious illness, the doctor recommended immediate surgery. Following the doctor's advice, I underwent the procedure, and a month passed before I was discharged a month since Jack had left us. Upon returning home, I found a demand letter for the car loan payment in the mailbox, a payment that should have been automatically deducted from my account. In a panic, I checked our finances, only to discover that our account, which previously held $30,000, was now almost empty, with just $55.90 remaining. It was clear to me Jack was responsible. The urge to confront him and demand the money back surged through me, but he was unreachable, and without the camper van he took, selling it to recover the funds wasn't an option. The realization that Jack had not only taken the van, but also drained our savings hit me hard. Physically weakened and financially devastated, I felt utterly helpless. Gary, sensing my despair, offered a comforting touch, his hand on my forehead. "You look pale, Mom. Are you okay?" His innocence and concern were touching, yet it pained me to admit the reality. "Physically, I might be fine, Gary, but your father took more than just the car, he took all our savings too. I can't work right now because of my health, and we're out of money. I just don't know what we're going to do," I confessed, the weight of our predicament pressing down on me. Despite the challenges, Gary's unwavering support provided a glimmer of hope. Together, we faced an uncertain future, but his resilience reminded me of the strength we shared as a family, even in the darkest of times. Motivated by my son's determination, I found myself pulling away from the grip of despair. "I see, then I'll find some work too," I declared, bolstered by my 12-year-old son's resolve to contribute by delivering newspapers and looking for work online. It wasn't the time to feel defeated. "Sorry for worrying you, Gary. I can't let myself be weakened by this. I'll shift my mindset and do everything in our power," I said, offering him a reassuring smile. Gary's smile mirrored mine, and then he proposed something wholly unexpected. "Let's figure out a way to get the camper van back from Dad." "How can we do that?" he asked with a spark of resolve in his eyes. "Yes, the camper van is registered in my name, but what can we do about that?" I pondered aloud, intrigued by his line of thinking. Gary then shared an idea so innovative it took me by surprise, an idea I hadn't considered. Despite not knowing Jack's whereabouts, Gary suggested we use technology at our fingertips. Recalling a family hiking trip where we had felt lost, we had bought Gary a kid's cell phone equipped with a GPS app accessible by both Jack and me. With this app, Gary believed we could track Jack's location in real time, a thought that hadn't crossed my mind. But what if we confront him and he manages to evade us again? I questioned, skeptical of our chances in such a scenario. "Don't worry, I've taken some precautions," Gary said, his smile widening with confidence. I was astonished by his foresight. While I was hospitalized, Gary had independently set a plan in motion, uncovering information about Jack's mistress and plotting our next steps with a maturity far beyond his years. "All right, let's show Dad the consequences of his betrayal," I agreed, feeling a newfound strength with Gary by my side. Together, we prepared to face Jack, my son's intelligence and bravery filling me with pride. With Gary by my side, I feel invincible. "Let's do this," I thought to myself, ready for whatever lay ahead. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Jack, sounding desperate. "Ah, it's me. I need your help. The police are questioning me about you, and they might ask me to come to the station voluntarily. Please help me," he pleaded. "Oh, is that so? Just wait a moment," I replied, maintaining my composure. Gary and I quickly headed to the location provided, a forest park near our house known for camping. There we found Jack being interrogated by the police beside his car, his expression a mix of confusion and dismay. The tables had turned. With careful planning and the element of surprise on our side, we were ready to face Jack and reclaim what was rightfully ours, standing united and stronger than ever. I took a deep breath and requested some privacy from the police, suggesting that Jack and I needed a moment to discuss matters privately. With an air of discomfort, heightened by the watchful eyes of bystanders, Jack hastily ushered Gary and me into the car. Inside, we were greeted by the sight of Jack's mistress sitting with an air of defiance, but her presence was the least of our concerns at that moment. "Sorry for the inconvenience, and thank you for coming. But why did the police show up? I'm confused," Jack started, genuinely puzzled by the turn of events. "The reason is simple. I reported the camper van as missing because, in essence, it was stolen," I explained calmly, despite the absurdity of Jack's logic that presumed marital disputes excluded criminal activities. "But we're married. How can it be stolen?" Jack argued, not grasping the gravity of his actions. I reminded him, "You filed for divorce, remember? That means, legally, we're no longer a couple but strangers. Taking a vehicle without the owner's consent is theft." It was Gary, with his sharp understanding, who pieced everything together, prompting a weak justification from Jack that he had only borrowed the van temporarily. "Well, I need my car back now. Handing over the keys would be very helpful," I said, extending my hand towards Jack, who, albeit reluctantly, complied. It was then that Gary, in his straightforward manner, questioned his father's decision to abandon his family for another woman. Caught off guard, Jack fumbled for words, only to be interrupted by his mistress's boastful claim of being the more attractive choice, which she believed justified Jack's departure. Gary's stern rebuke silenced her, turning the focus back on Jack for an explanation. When Jack hesitated, Gary threatened to involve the police again, prompting a hurried admission. Jack revealed that Martha, the other woman, had joined his company 5 months prior, and their affair began shortly after. The revelation of Martha's pregnancy led Jack to the decision to leave us and start anew with her. "Why did you take the camper van?" I asked, aiming to understand the rationale behind his decision amidst the chaos of his actions and decisions. "After leaving my job, I contemplated selling the camper van for some extra cash. However, it seemed you had other plans, Jack, using it for your escapades. I figured it was too hasty to sell it immediately, so we took it for a trip instead." "But how did you keep track of all this?" Jack asked, puzzled. I reminded him of the little safeguard we put in place after Gary's fox misadventure during a family hike. "Remember, we bought Gary a child's phone and installed a GPS tracking app. You seem to have forgotten we installed the same app on your phone. So I've been aware of your whereabouts all along." To my surprise, Gary later confessed he had orchestrated getting lost on that hike as a ploy to secure a phone for himself, a revelation that highlighted his cunning and foresight. "I had my suspicions about Dad, so I devised this plan to keep an eye on him," Gary admitted, showcasing his adeptness at strategy. "You're quite the formidable child, Gary. I strive never to be the kind of adult who betrays those who matter." Without a second thought, Jack said, a trace of realization in his tone. Confronted by the blunt truth from his son, Jack appeared defeated, a stark contrast to the empowered feeling Gary's assertiveness and maturity instilled in me. As a mother, this bolstered my resolve to ensure everything was settled justly. "And about the $30,000 you took from our account," I pressed on, "that money needs to be returned immediately. It was our family's savings." Jack protested, "But we were married. I don't have to give it back." "That's where you're wrong. The money was mine, saved painstakingly from before we were even together. Your history of quitting jobs never really contributed to our savings, did it?" I countered, dismayed yet vindicated to learn how the money was frivolously wasted by Jack and his mistress. It was a moment that cemented my relief over our impending divorce. So this is how it stands. If you appropriated the van and my savings for your use, that's a criminal offense, I informed him, ready to address the matter legally if necessary. Jack, trying to dismiss the severity, retorted, "I've already sent the police away. It's not their concern anymore, right? I only agreed we would have a discussion." This encounter underscored the stark realities and the necessity of standing firm, ensuring that justice was served for the sake of our family's future and dignity. In the midst of our confrontation, I made it clear that retracting the complaint was out of the question. In fact, I was determined to add the theft of my money to the existing report. Sensing the gravity of the situation, Gary, ever so ready, offered to contact the police immediately using a quick feature on his child's phone. Martha, who had been silently observing our heated exchange from within the confines of the camper van, attempted a swift exit but was met with a startling surprise. Outside, her parents awaited, their expressions a vivid display of rage and disappointment. Her attempt to leave was halted by their presence, and her apologies were drowned out by their furious reprimands. "Why are you here? How did you find out?" Martha stammered, caught off guard. "I took the liberty of contacting your parents in advance," I revealed. This turn of events was made possible by Gary's initiative. During my hospitalization, he had visited Jack's workplace to share our distressing situation. Moved by Gary's genuine distress, Jack's colleagues connected the dots to Martha, leading to the discovery of her parents' address. Jack and Martha's overly familiar behavior had not gone unnoticed at the office, further fueled by compromising photos from the company's welcoming party for new employees. With this information and Martha's known commute from her parents' house, I sought out her parents, shared the ordeal we were enduring, and arranged for them to be present at this pivotal moment. Martha's frustration was palpable as she accused me of betrayal, to which I retorted with my own grievances. The conversation took an unexpected turn when I commented on Martha's noticeably pregnant state, questioning the due date of the baby she was expecting in 5 months. This revelation brought the timeline into sharp focus, revealing a glaring discrepancy with the duration of her relationship with Jack. Caught off guard, Jack could only stare in disbelief as the realization dawned upon him. The child Martha was carrying could not possibly be his, given the timeline of their affair. This revelation exposed not just the infidelity, but also the deception Martha had orchestrated. Caught in her web of lies, Martha's facade crumbled as she nearly confessed to her deceit. Jack, now faced with the truth, was forced to confront the consequences of his actions, and the reality that the life he thought he was building on a foundation of lies was crumbling before his eyes. Caught in the midst of deception, Jack's frustration boiled over as he accused Martha of ruining his life with her lies. "You're so gullible, not seeing through the lies at all. A real fool," he exclaimed, as their argument spiraled into an ugly exchange. Amidst their quarrel, we reached out to the police to update them on the unfolding drama. As night fell, the forest park was illuminated by the eerie glow of police car lights, setting a dramatic scene for the conclusion of this ordeal. In a moment of desperation, Jack pleaded for forgiveness, acknowledging his wrongdoings and vowing never to stray again. However, Gary, wise beyond his years, dismissed his father's sudden change of heart with a dose of reality. People don't change overnight, especially not someone as unreliable as you. Echoing Gary's sentiment, I made it clear to Jack that I could not trust his hollow promises. "It's time for you to face the consequences of your actions at the police station. As for the money, worry about repaying it after you've served your time," I told him, firm in my resolve. Jack worried about his ability to repay the stolen funds if incarcerated, but I assured him that arrangements would be made. "Once you're out, you'll work off your debt, including the $30,000 you took and child support for Gary. We'll calculate the total amount owed," I explained, already having a plan in place for his employment and repayment. Turning to Martha, I reminded her of her role in this debacle. You might consider yourself merely a bystander, but you're complicit in Jack's actions. Be ready to face the consequences. Her plea for help from her parents was met with rejection. They could not support a daughter who brought trouble upon others. Eventually, Jack and Martha were taken into custody, a testament to Gary's strategic thinking. Although they were released from detention shortly thereafter, they were confronted with a substantial financial obligation to me, arranged through legal channels. I successfully claimed $30,000 in damages and secured a child support agreement from Jack amounting to $800 monthly for Gary. Furthermore, I facilitated Jack's employment at a subcontracting factory associated with my workplace, ensuring his debts to us would be deducted directly from his earnings. With the camper van sold and the loan settled, my health saw a significant improvement, rejuvenating my energy and dedication to my work. Gary, too, took on more responsibilities around the house, embodying resilience and perseverance. Together, we look forward to moving ahead, stronger and more united than ever, ensuring Gary has every opportunity to follow his dreams without hindrance. Today marks a significant chapter in my life as I stand in the comfort of my own home, surrounded by its walls that hold countless memories. Jack, with a beam of pride illuminating his face, welcomes me with open arms, his gestures mirroring his joy as he explores the spacious room with an enthusiasm that's almost infectious. We find ourselves in the heart of my family's abode, a place where my father's dreams took shape. Blessed with considerable wealth, my father poured his heart and soul into this home, transforming it into a masterpiece valued at an astonishing $100 million. This house stands as a testament to his dedication and passion, a legacy he entrusted to me before his departure from this world. Now, as I navigate through life without him, my husband asserts his claim over this cherished inheritance, suggesting that what was once solely mine should now be recognized as ours. Despite my insistence on its significance to me and me alone, he remains undeterred, armed with a smirk and unwavering confidence. Yet I hold on to proof, evidence that underscores my rightful ownership, documents bearing my name, Sarah, as the sole heir. At 42, my life is intertwined with the digital realm, thanks to my role at an online bank. This career path wasn't chosen at random, but was influenced by the values instilled in me by my parents. With their expertise in financial management, they taught me the importance of fiscal responsibility, lessons that have stayed with me into adulthood. Growing up in affluence, they ensured that I understood the value of money, urging me to appreciate and conserve it. Despite our financial standing, my upbringing was marked by modesty. My allowance hardly surpassed those of my peers, and lavish dining was an exception, not the norm. My education was rooted in the community, attending a local public school over an exclusive private institution. Yet, rumors of our family's wealth spread, painting a picture of a life filled with luxury and endless indulgences. Sarah, with your massive house and wealth, life must be a breeze, right? You must have all the latest gadgets and games. Can we come over to play? Such questions were commonplace, yet they couldn't be further from the truth. My reality was far from the opulence many imagined. Despite not having the most expensive toys or the newest game consoles, the assumption was that I lived a life of extravagance. I often found myself at the center of unwelcome attention, with peers perceiving my family's financial status as an opportunity for their gain. "Sarah, you're wealthy, aren't you? Could you lend me some money?" Such inquiries made me uncomfortable, highlighting a stark contrast between the perceived notion of my lifestyle and the values my parents worked hard to instill in me. In a twist of fate, I found myself in a tricky situation when I accidentally damaged Maria's gaming console. At the moment, my pockets were empty, and the timing couldn't have been worse. Around the same time, July and I had just started our journey as fifth-grade classmates. She questioned whether I had shared this dilemma with my parents, but the fear of their disappointment sealed my lips. "I can't tell them. They might get upset. That's why I'm turning to you, Sarah," she confessed. The thought of saying no weighed heavily on me, fearing it might lead to an uncomfortable atmosphere at school. However, my parents' firm stance on not lending money left me with no choice but to apologize to Julie for my inability to help financially. My refusal left Julie in tears, and it wasn't long before whispers began to spread. Accusations were thrown my way, questioning my reluctance to aid a friend in need given my family's financial stability. I found myself entangled in a situation that I had no part in creating, steadfastly explaining that my hands were tied due to a lack of funds. Amidst this, Maria chimed in with a judgment that stung, suggesting that I valued money over friendship. The situation escalated as Maria and Julie wove a web of lies around me, claiming I had borrowed money without repaying and refused to cover the cost of the broken console. The school's faculty soon untangled the truth, reprimanding Maria and Julie for their actions. Unfortunately, their warnings only fueled the fire, and the rumors spread like wildfire, eventually reaching my parents. In response, my father took it upon himself to address the matter, leading to a meeting with the involved families. Despite receiving half-hearted apologies, I chose to keep my distance from Maria and Julie thereafter, enduring their occasional mocking glances but no direct confrontation. That evening, over dinner, my father offered a piece of advice that I would carry with me for years. With a reassuring smile, he reminded me of the importance of standing firm in my decisions, especially regarding financial matters. "Sarah, always remember, it's okay to say no. You don't have to disclose whether you have money. If someone persists, just say you'll need to ask your parents, even though you know it's not permitted." This lesson on navigating financial disputes with grace and firmness became a cornerstone of my approach to friendships and financial interactions. As I moved on from elementary school and later graduated from university, I became more cautious about whom I invited into my personal space, focusing on building relationships grounded in character rather than material wealth. My career post-university was marked by a deliberate effort to steer clear of financial entanglements, dedicating my energy to my work and maintaining a private personal life. This experience taught me the value of boundaries, both in friendships and finances, shaping the person I've become today. At the age of 35, I crossed paths with Jack, who would later become my partner in life. Our meeting was orchestrated by a mutual friend, and despite Jack being a year my junior, his sincere and buoyant spirit quickly won me over. His candor was a breath of fresh air, and it wasn't long before our casual dating blossomed into a serious relationship. 2 years down the line, we celebrated our union with a vibrant wedding ceremony, much to the delight of my parents, who warmly embraced Jack into our family. About a month into our marriage, my father, perhaps sensing the depth of our bond, proposed the idea of having Jack over at our place. Although I had full confidence in Jack, I harbored some reservations about his penchant for conversation, fearing he might inadvertently divulge sensitive family information. However, emboldened by a month of marital bliss, I decided it was time Jack knew everything about my background. Thus, I extended an invitation to him to visit my parents' home. Jack's reaction upon stepping into my family's residence was one of sheer astonishment. His awe was palpable, a clear indication that the reality of my family's situation had taken him by surprise. The visit, although warm, left Jack with an insatiable curiosity about our financial standing, a topic he broached repeatedly during our journey home. My own knowledge on the specifics of our family wealth was vague, yet Jack's inquiries stirred a sense of unease within me. A few months into our marriage, I received a distressing call from my mother, informing me that my father was to be hospitalized. The news came as a shock, further compounded by the revelation of his recent health struggles, which until then had gone unnoticed by me. Reflecting on our last visit, I recalled my father's diminished appetite and frail appearance, which now filled me with regret and concern. Accompanying my mother to the hospital that Saturday, I was greeted by my father's attempt at cheerfulness, though his somber mood was unmistakable. His apology, for what he perceived as a burden to us, underscored his gentle nature. The subsequent diagnosis of advanced pancreatic cancer, with its spread beyond the possibility of surgical intervention, left us in a state of disbelief and sorrow. The notion that someone as health-conscious as my father could fall victim to such a cruel fate was beyond our comprehension. In the aftermath of the diagnosis, my father's resolve was touching. He expressed a desire for our happiness, a sentiment that moved us to tears. Resolved to cherish every moment with him, I found myself restricted by hospital protocols, which limited visits to immediate family members. My father's longing for the presence of friends and the creation of joyful memories at our home was a poignant reminder of the life he wished for us. Determined to honor his wishes, I pledged to uphold the legacy of our home as a place of warmth and joy, even in his absence. The promise to cherish our family home became a testament to my father's enduring spirit and the deep bonds that tied us together. Driven by a desire to fulfill my father's dream, I decided to renovate our family home, a project that became my solace and focus during a challenging time. Jack, ever attentive, expressed concern over how much time I devoted to my father in his final days, oblivious to the complexities surrounding our family estate that I had kept from him. When Jack inquired about my father's health, I confided in him about the difficult journey we were facing, finding some comfort in his support despite the whirlwind of work, hospital visits, and the emotional toll it was taking on me. However, tension surfaced when Jack's curiosity veered towards my father's finances and estate. His suggestions of involving legal advice to discuss financial matters, just in case something happened to my mother, too struck a nerve, dredging up painful memories. While my father had a trusted lawyer, Jack's insistence on being prudent about financial affairs began to create an emotional chasm between us. In the ensuing months, my father bravely fought his illness, but eventually passed away. The inheritance discussions that followed among family members led to me receiving a substantial house valued at $5.5 million. Jack's escalating interest in the inheritance, despite my attempts to keep him at bay, only intensified the strain. His excitement about moving into the big mansion and his intrusive questions about financial details took me by surprise, especially when I learned he had been informed by my cousin at the funeral, whose offhand remarks about the house being a waste if left empty only added to the tension. My explanations to Jack that the inheritance was not communal property seemed to fall on deaf ears, leading to an increase in hostility between us. Although he was present at my father's funeral, Jack distanced himself from the responsibilities and support needed during the subsequent memorial services and inheritance formalities. After some time, as life began to find its new normal, Jack revealed a shocking turn of events. He claimed to have changed the ownership of my family home into his name, presenting legal documents as evidence. This revelation not only breached the trust I had placed in him, but also underscored a profound misunderstanding of the boundaries and respect integral to our relationship. The complexity of navigating inheritance matters had unveiled deeper issues in our marriage, prompting a reevaluation of our values, trust, and the future direction of our partnership. The revelation from Jack left me reeling, struggling to comprehend his actions. He bluntly admitted his fatigue from our relationship, suggesting we could coexist as housemates in the family home, albeit with me receiving minimal financial support. His ultimatum of divorce, if I resisted, was a jarring twist to our already strained relationship. In a mix of shock and despair, I implored him to reconsider his sudden decision and the unauthorized change in property ownership. Jack disclosed that he had sought legal counsel to facilitate the ownership transfer without my consent. The situation escalated to the point where divorce seemed the only viable resolution. Heartbroken and disoriented, I began to distance myself from the home and life I shared with Jack, attributing his betrayal to the corrupting influence of potential wealth. The following day, Jack's demand for the house keys, claiming ownership of my ancestral home, pushed the situation into further turmoil. His attempts to forcefully enter the property were thwarted by the timely intervention of security personnel. I presented the authentic ownership documents to the guards, firmly establishing my rightful claim to the house and inheritance from my father. Jack, confronted with the undeniable proof of my ownership, was visibly shaken. His misunderstanding stemmed from a supposed legal advisor named Jerry, who had promised to navigate the complexities of inheritance law on his behalf. Entrusting Jerry with a significant sum of $360,000 to alter the property's registration, Jack had fallen victim to a deceitful scheme. In the midst of this confrontation, Jack's emotions surfaced as he repeatedly attempted to contact Jerry, only to be met with silence. His frustration boiled over, denouncing Jerry as a fraudster preying on those blinded by greed. Jack then directed his bitterness towards me, criticizing my expenditure on what he deemed frivolous, questioning my understanding of inheritance registration and associated costs. Despite his attempts to salvage our marriage, suggesting we reconsider the divorce, the breach of trust and the depth of his deception were insurmountable. I requested the security guard to escort him away, closing a painful chapter of my life. In the months that followed, reflection and distance allowed me to process the events, reinforcing the importance of trust and honesty in the foundation of any relationship. The ordeal with Jack, underscored by manipulation and betrayal, served as a poignant lesson in guarding against the allure of wealth at the expense of personal integrity and love. On the solemn occasion of my father's first memorial service, held at our family temple, Jack made an unexpected appearance. Since our divorce, life had not been kind to him. Jobless, entangled in financial woes, and seemingly betrayed by those he once trusted, Jack cut a forlorn figure. His disheveled state spoke volumes of his plight, standing in stark contrast to the respectful solemnity of the day. As he attempted to express his apologies amidst tears, his actions inadvertently shifted the focus away from the memorial, causing a stir among my relatives. Despite his emotional turmoil, I found myself compelled to ask him to leave, a request that ultimately necessitated intervention by security. This incident, happening during such a poignant moment, left me with mixed feelings. Eager to move forward and distance myself from the shadows of our shared past, I decided to relocate from my parents' home, a decision that had been in the works. I settled into a new abode, severing my connections with Jack, who, despite everything, continued to visit the family property, now transformed into a thriving rental villa. My mother and I embarked on this new venture together, managing the villa that blossomed into a vibrant place of joy and respite for many. Jack, on his end, appeared to have embarked on a path of self-improvement, securing a new job and earnestly pursuing a fresh start. The transformation of our family home into a rental villa not only honored my father's vision, but also became a haven for guests from diverse backgrounds. The villa, celebrated for its picturesque setting and expansive garden, quickly grew in popularity, hosting an array of events from intimate weddings to joyous family gatherings. Managing it alongside my mother deepened our bond and immersed us in a fulfilling journey of hospitality and service. In time, the success of the villa enabled us to enhance its offerings, introducing a swimming pool, an inviting outdoor lounge area, and a playful corner for children. Our dedication to creating a welcoming and memorable experience for our guests solidified the villa's status as a premier destination, drawing travelers in search of tranquility and unforgettable moments. This venture not only allowed us to realize my father's dream, but also provided a platform for creating cherished memories, echoing the warmth and hospitality that he always envisioned for our home. While tending to the garden of our rental villa, a sense of profound satisfaction washed over me. The transformation of our family home into a haven where guests could gather, celebrate, and forge enduring memories filled me with pride. I could almost feel my father's pride in what we had achieved with his vision. This venture had not only turned his dream into reality, but also bestowed upon us financial stability and a newfound independence. The journey here taught me invaluable lessons about trust, money, and the resilience needed to carve out my own path, distinct from the shadows of my past experiences. In this journey of self-discovery, I learned that adversity could indeed shape a more resilient and determined future. News about Jack reached me through mutual acquaintances, indicating he had managed to steer his life in a positive direction. Securing a meaningful job and learning from his previous missteps, Jack's progress was a testament to the transformative power of confronting and overcoming personal challenges. Knowing he was doing well brought a sense of peace, affirming that both of us were on our respective paths toward healing and self-improvement. Ultimately, my father's dream served as a catalyst for growth, not just for my mother and me, but for everyone who crossed the threshold of the rental villa. It became a sanctuary where guests could experience joy and make memories to cherish for a lifetime. The success of the villa stands as a living legacy of my father's vision, constantly reminding us of the values of resilience, determination, and the profound impact of realizing one's dreams. Through this endeavor, we've created a space that extends beyond mere accommodation. It's a source of joy, a site for celebration, and a testament to the enduring spirit of dreaming big and working hard to make those dreams come true.
That day, I took my granddaughter away from that toxic environment. I couldn't let her suffer like that any longer. And so I raised Zinnia on my own for the next 10 years. We moved overseas, far away from Caspian and Emberly, and built a life together, just the two of us. 10 years later, when Zinnia and I finally returned to our home country, Caspian and Emberly came to see us. They stood at my door, smiling like nothing had ever happened. "We missed you," they said, trying to act like a loving family. "We're family after all. Let's live together." But I wasn't fooled. I looked them both in the eyes and said, "Idiots who can't appreciate their own children aren't family. Please go back." My name is Serafina, and I'm a 55-year-old widow. A few years ago, I lost my husband, and I've been living alone ever since in a large, quiet house. After my husband passed, I considered living with Caspian and Emberly, but something in my heart told me it was better to live separately. I loved my son, but there had always been tension between us, and his wife didn't make things any easier. Caspian and Emberly ran a bar, and I knew that if I lived with them, I'd likely get pulled into helping out there. I wasn't as young as I used to be, and the idea of serving customers all day didn't sit well with me. I wasn't great with people, and frankly, my body wasn't up to the task anymore. So, I chose to stay on my own, even after my husband was gone. Caspian never suggested we live together either, and I was thankful for that. I finally had some freedom after years of taking care of others. At first, living alone felt like a blessing. I no longer had to worry about caring for my husband or raising children. I thought I'd enjoy the peace and quiet. But as the days passed, I realized just how lonely life could be. I had no hobbies or friends, having spent all my life focusing on my family. The silence in the house was deafening, and I spent my days watching reruns of old TV dramas, trying to pass the time. I made a few attempts to pick up new hobbies, but none of them stuck. My life felt empty. The only light in my days came from my granddaughters, Eloan and Zinnia. Eloan, the oldest, was a bright, beautiful girl, always cheerful and full of energy. Zinnia, on the other hand, was quieter and more reserved, often standing in the shadow of her older sister. Eloan was always praised for being mature beyond her years, while Zinnia was often overlooked. My heart ached for her. Every time Caspian and Emberly brought the girls over to visit, Eloan would run up to me, smiling, dressed in new clothes with her hair perfectly styled. Zinnia, however, wore Eloan's old, worn-out hand-me-downs, her hair always messy and unkempt. It was clear that Zinnia was treated differently, not just by her parents, but even by Eloan. While Eloan's smile lit up the room, Zinnia's eyes were always downcast, her face clouded with sadness. She had once been a talkative, lively little girl, but over time, she had grown quieter, retreating into herself. I couldn't help but feel protective of her, even though I tried not to interfere too much in how Caspian and Emberly were raising their children. But every time they visited, my concern grew. Caspian and Emberly would dote on Eloan, showering her with attention, while Zinnia sat quietly unnoticed. Whenever I tried to speak to Zinnia, either Eloan would interrupt, or Caspian and Emberly would change the subject, completely ignoring her. One day, I decided to visit Caspian and Emberly at their house. I brought along some sweets that I knew the girls liked, hoping to spend a nice afternoon with them. As I approached the door, I heard shouting from inside. Caspian's voice echoed through the walls, filled with anger. "Why don't you say something for once instead of staying quiet all the time?" My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the doorbell, but before I could ring it, the door swung open. Without a second thought, I stepped inside, taking off my shoes. The shouting grew louder as I walked down the hallway, and I heard Caspian's voice again, accusingly. "You know it's your fault, right? Your silence embarrasses us." I climbed the stairs, my heart racing, and found them in a room upstairs. Caspian and Emberly were standing over Zinnia, who was sitting on the floor, her face red with tears, her cheeks swollen from being slapped. Eloan stood nearby, her hand still raised, as if she had just struck her sister. I couldn't stay silent any longer. I shoved my son and his wife aside and rushed over to Zinnia, who was sitting on the floor, hugging her tightly. Eloan stood nearby, wide-eyed, while Caspian and Emberly stared at me in shock, though they quickly regained their composure. "Mom, what are you doing? Barging in like this?" "You should have knocked first," Caspian snapped, clearly irritated. "That's right, Serafina. Isn't this a bit rude of you?" Emberly added, her voice laced with annoyance. I glared at both of them, my anger rising. "What's rude is what you're doing to a little girl, surrounding her like this and yelling. Caspian, you're her father. Aren't you ashamed to treat your child this way? And Eloan, why did you hit your sister?" For the first time, I raised my voice at Eloan. She looked scared at first, then dropped her head and mumbled, "Because..." Before Eloan could explain, Emberly pulled her into a tight hug, glaring at me. "Don't blame Eloan for this," she snapped, clearly protective of her older daughter. But I wasn't backing down. I met her glare with one of my own. "A mother's job isn't to protect a child who's done wrong. You should be teaching her right from wrong, not defending her behavior." Caspian, who had been watching quietly, suddenly pointed at me and yelled, "Mom, what are you thinking? Get away from that idiot." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "The idiots are you and Emberly. You owe Zinnia an apology. I shouted back. Apologize? Who's going to apologize to her? Caspian sneered, clearly not taking my words seriously. Neither he, Emberly, nor Aloan showed any remorse. They just continued to insult Zinnia as if it was the most normal thing in the world. Zinnia, who was now in my arms, clung weakly to my clothes, her face blank and vacant, as if she had endured this treatment for far too long. Before I could even process what was happening, I scooped her up and declared, I'm taking care of Zinnia from now on. I can't leave her in this house. Without waiting for a response, I marched out of the room, leaving them stunned. But before I could get far, Caspian followed me, a smirk plastered across his face. Thanks, Mom. I didn't know what to do with that mute, he said casually, as if he had just solved a problem. I was speechless. My son, my own child, was treating his daughter like a burden. As I stood there, trying to comprehend his heartless words, Emberly appeared behind him, carrying a small, worn-out bag and a tattered backpack. Here's Zinnia's stuff, she said, shoving the bags into my hands without any care. Please take care of the rest. Both Zinnia and I stood there, speechless, staring at the faces of my son and daughter-in-law. Their expressions were cold, almost relieved that Zinnia was leaving their home. Without another word, I turned and walked away, unable to process the cruelty of the situation. When we got back to my house, I helped Zinnia take off her shoes at the door. As I looked down at her, I saw her biting her lip, trying to hold back her tears. The sight of her broke my heart, and I hugged her tightly, gently rubbing her back. Zinnia, I'm so sorry, I whispered. I'm sorry I didn't help you sooner, but it's going to be okay now. Grandma's here, and I'm going to protect you from now on. From that day forward, Zinnia and I began living together. The damage done by her parents had taken its toll, and she stopped speaking altogether. Even the simplest words like good morning seemed impossible for her to say. Her teacher mentioned that she wasn't communicating at school either, not with her classmates, nor with her teachers. Worried, I took her to the hospital for a checkup. The doctors diagnosed Zinnia with selective mutism, explaining that the extreme stress she had experienced at home had caused deep-seated anxiety and fear. It wasn't that she didn't want to speak. She simply couldn't. The doctor assured me that, with time and a more nurturing environment, she would gradually regain her voice. On the way home, I bought her a notebook and a colorful pen. Zinnia, I said, handing them to her. If there's something you want to say but can't, write it in this notebook. You can draw pictures or write words, and maybe little by little, you can try saying the words out loud. It doesn't have to be all at once, just a little at a time, okay? Zinnia immediately opened the notebook and started writing. After a few moments, she turned it around to show me. On the page, she had written, "Thank you, Grandma," along with a small drawing of my face. She opened her mouth, as if trying to say the words, but nothing came out. Her face fell, disappointed. I smiled and patted her head gently. You're doing great, Zinnia. You've already taken the first step, and I'm so proud of you. One step at a time, okay? You've got this. Zinnia managed a faint smile, and from that day on, she used the notebook to communicate both at home and at school. Gradually, she started to gain confidence, and over the next 2 years, she began to speak again. Grandma, guess what happened at school today? She'd say excitedly when she came home, brimming with joy and life. Seeing her recover and thrive filled me with pride and relief. One day, I attended a parent-teacher conference at her school. As we walked into the classroom, a warm and kind teacher greeted us with a smile. "Hello, Serafina." "Hello, Zinnia," she said, welcoming us in. As we sat down, the teacher pulled out Zinnia's report card. "Her grades have improved steadily since last year," she said, showing us the chart that displayed Zinnia's academic progress. The trend was clear. She had been doing exceptionally well ever since she started living with me. I smiled proudly, patting Zinnia's head. "She's been studying so hard," I explained. "At home, she's always reading books and solving difficult problems." Since regaining her voice, Zinnia had developed a passion for learning. Every time she aced a test, she'd bring the results home with a big smile on her face, and I would hang her perfect papers on the wall. Watching her grow and succeed was the greatest reward of all. I think it might be a good idea for Zinnia to take an IQ test at the hospital, the teacher suggested during a school meeting one day. Surprised, I asked for more details. An IQ test? What for? The teacher explained that Zinnia might be what they called gifted, a term used for children who possess extraordinary intelligence. According to her, Zinnia seemed to be exceptionally smart, even more so than most adults. The idea intrigued me. If Zinnia was indeed gifted, it would explain why schoolwork seemed too easy for her. The teacher thought an IQ test might help us figure out how to provide the right learning environment to nurture her talents. Without hesitation, I took Zinnia to the hospital to have the test done. As it turned out, the teacher was right. Zinnia was gifted, and her IQ was well above average. I was stunned, amazed to learn that my granddaughter possessed such an extraordinary ability. Later that day, I sat her down and asked, "How do you find school? Do you enjoy your studies?" Zinnia, with a bored expression, shrugged. "Honestly, it's too easy, and I find it boring. I want to study something more challenging, but when I try to tell the teacher, they just don't understand." Her words made me pause. I began to wonder if there was a way to challenge her mind in ways her current school couldn't. Her academic needs seemed far beyond elementary school level, perhaps even at the middle or high school level. But would Zinnia, a young girl who hadn't even graduated from elementary school yet, be able to handle such advanced studies? I consulted with her teacher again, who told me about a system in the US where students could skip grades based on their academic abilities. The teacher suggested that if we moved to America, Zinnia might have the chance to study at a level more suited to her extraordinary talents. This reminded me of my late husband's brother, who had been living and working in the US. Although I hadn't been in contact with him since my husband passed away, I decided to reach out for advice. When I explained the situation, he immediately offered his support, saying he would help us settle into life in America. Feeling relieved, I suggested the idea of studying abroad to Zinnia. She listened quietly, then smiled. "I want to go," she said, "but only if it's with you, Grandma. And I want to graduate elementary school with my friends first." Touched by her thoughtfulness, I agreed. "Of course, we'll wait until you graduate. And in the meantime, I'll work on improving my English," I told her. Zinnia's smile widened in relief. The next few months were full of happy memories. Zinnia made the most of her final year in elementary school, creating lasting friendships and enjoying her time. When she finally graduated, we exchanged contact information with her friends so they could keep in touch even after we moved overseas. I decided not to mention our plans to Caspian and Emberly. I feared they might try to take Zinnia back if they found out she was gifted, only to exploit her abilities for their own gain. Once we moved to America, Zinnia adjusted quickly. She skipped grades and threw herself into her studies with enthusiasm. I supported her in every way I could, and seeing her excitement about learning again reassured me that we had made the right decision. As time went on, Zinnia's talents truly began to shine. She not only excelled in school but eventually enrolled at Harvard University, where she studied business. Before I knew it, she had started her own company. "I want to repay you, Grandma," she often said with enthusiasm. But to me, she had already repaid me in the best way possible, by growing into a brilliant, capable, and kind-hearted young woman. Zinnia's success didn't go unnoticed. Her achievements were featured in American news outlets, and soon her name was known around the world. She became a celebrity in her own right, her story inspiring many. I often wondered what Caspian and Emberly thought of her accomplishments. Did they regret the way they had treated her? I hoped for their sake they did. 10 years after Zinnia started her company, we had to return to our home country for business reasons. We rented a new apartment, trying to stay under the radar. But one afternoon, the doorbell rang. Thinking it was a delivery, I opened the door without a second thought. "Mom, it's been a while. How have you been?" Caspian's voice hit me like a wave of shock. Standing beside him was Emberly, smiling in a way that made my stomach turn. I couldn't hide my surprise. "Caspian? Emberly? What are you doing here?" They ignored my confusion. Emberly, stepping closer, called into the house. "Zinnia, we've come to see you. It's your mom and dad." I quickly moved to block the door. What do you want? Please don't come near my daughter. Caspian gave me a pitying smile. Don't be so cold, Mom. We're still her parents. We just want to see her. That's all. Yes, mother-in-law. Emberly chimed in. We're family, after all. Please let us talk to her. Before I could stop them, they pushed past me and entered the house. Zinnia, hearing the commotion, peeked out from the living room. What's going on, Grandma? She asked. Then her eyes landed on Caspian and Emberly, and she froze, surprised. Caspian and Emberly, however, seemed thrilled to see her. Oh, Zinnia, look at you. You've grown so much, Emberly exclaimed, reaching out to hug her, but Zinnia brushed her off coldly. If you want to talk, we can do it in the living room. I'll make some tea, Zinnia said, her voice icy. Without waiting for a reply, she went into the kitchen. Caspian and Emberly, unfazed, plopped down on the sofa and began reminiscing loudly, as if nothing had ever happened. Feeling uneasy, I glanced at Zinnia, who winked at me, signaling that she had everything under control. As I sat down opposite them, the conversation quickly turned to the real reason for their visit. The bar they had been running had gone under due to poor management, and Aloan, their eldest daughter, had disappeared, cutting all contact with them. Now jobless and struggling financially, Caspian and Emberly were desperate. Zinnia, would you consider supporting us? Caspian asked, his voice filled with desperation. You may have left when you were little, but we raised you for 6 years. You owe us. That's right, Emberly added, her tone pleading. We're still your family. Let's make up for lost time. Let's live together and create new memories. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could they, after everything they had done, come crawling back to Zinnia, expecting her to help them now that she was successful? Before I could say anything, Zinnia's voice cut through the tension. Idiots aren't my family, she said, her expression calm and composed. My only family is Grandma. Now, please leave. Caspian and Emberly stared at her in disbelief, but Zinnia stood firm, calmly walking to the door and opening it. Goodbye. With a final click of the door lock, Caspian and Emberly were gone, slinking away in defeat. I watched them go, still in shock. But when I turned to Zinnia, she just smiled. Grandma, she said, how about we move? She explained that she had been secretly planning to build a house for the two of us, designed with accessibility features to make sure I would be comfortable as I aged. I couldn't hold back my gratitude. Thank you, Zinnia, I whispered, tears in my eyes. She just blushed and gave an embarrassed laugh. Several months later, we moved into our new home. The walls were filled with memories we had created together over the years, and even the notebook and pen we had bought when she first came to live with me were framed and on display. Every time I looked at them, I felt a deep sense of pride and love. Today, I decided to cook Zinnia's favorite dish. Smiling, I headed into the kitchen, my heart full. Helen worked as a cleaner for a construction company in the city. She was short, full-figured, and always dressed in a pair of knockoff rags. Sometimes, she showed up for work smelling of alcohol, and on those days, she was unable to work properly. Her older daughter, Rosie, a thin and pale schoolgirl, worked alongside her. Rosie was the first, but not the last child in the family. Helen had given birth to many children, but couldn't name the fathers of any of them. Helen spent all her spare time with local vagrants and drunks who often visited her home, regardless of the time of day. They spent hours clanging bottles in the living room and talking loudly. The children were used to the fact that, during these moments, they needed to quickly grab something from the kitchen, at least bread, to avoid going hungry, and then sit quietly in their room while the company had their fun. Helen's children grew up like weeds in a field, almost from birth, accustomed to taking care of each other. Rosie, the eldest daughter, had just turned 18. While still in school, she worked part-time several times a week at a clothing store, sorting and hanging up clothes. The second child was Paul, who had just turned 12. He spent most of his time outside, but never refused to help his older sister at home, knowing that she would always give him something from her meager salary. The youngest, Judy, would turn 7 in a few months. She was a quiet and sickly child who struggled to communicate with her peers. When she went out to the playground, she was like a frightened little animal, always staying away from the noisy courtyard children. Judy envied the neighboring girls who built sandcastles or pushed beautiful dolls in bright toy strollers around the yard. But such toys were never in Judy's family. All she had to play with was an old, battered teddy bear with one eye missing and a small plastic bucket with an equally small shovel. Throughout Rosie's years in school, teachers always praised the diligent student and used her as an example for her classmates. Rosie easily understood any subject. It was enough for her to read the material once, and she was ready to answer on the board immediately. All the teachers knew the family the girl was growing up in and felt sorry for her. She's so smart, almost an excellent student. It's a shame she doesn't have a better future with such a mother, the teachers whispered among themselves. If it weren't for taking care of her younger siblings, she could have easily gone to college. Though, being a cleaner doesn't require that, the vice principal added. She's going to have to substitute for her mother now, otherwise, she'll be fired because Helen's pregnant again. Even though Helen tried to hide her 6-month pregnancy, it was already noticeable. Everyone knew there would soon be another addition to the family, but they didn't even suspect what it would be. At the age of 45, Helen already had 3 children, though it was unclear who the fathers were. Helen was expecting twins. Probably, there wasn't a single person who didn't condemn this negligent mother of many children. Everyone who knew her thought she only needed children for social benefits. It was difficult to support 3 children on a cleaning lady's salary, but Helen still managed to host wild drinking parties with her friends. Fortunately, sympathetic neighbors occasionally brought bags of clothes to her door, which the entire family wore. Children in the neighborhood would shout after Helen, "Hey, rag woman, bring my socks. Maybe you're bringing my underwear." Rosie and Judy tried to walk away quickly, but Helen hadn't paid attention to such treatment for a long time. In the last months of her pregnancy, Helen found it increasingly difficult to work. Rosie had to replace her every time Helen felt unwell. Her boss, who had little regard for Helen, simply wanted the floors cleaned, and he was pleased to have Rosie, who did the job much better than her mother. Rosie, feeling sorry for her mother and fearing she might get fired, rushed to the office to clean right after school and then studied until midnight. This was heartbreaking for Rosie because it was not the future she had dreamed of. All she thought about was seeing herself in a beautiful uniform with a neat hairstyle. When she was 10 years old, she found a magazine featuring such beauties standing by the gangway of a huge liner. Since then, this picture has hung over her bed and symbolized an unattainable goal. Teachers at school knew about her dream and tried to support her, urging her not to give up and to pursue it. Rosie was very attractive, quite unlike her mother, with delicate facial features. If Helen hadn't pregnant again, Rosie might have tried to enroll in stewardess school. However, she understood that as soon as her mother gave birth, she would have to become the family's breadwinner, leaving no time for further education. Nevertheless, the hope of realizing her dream still burned in her soul, and she even started setting aside a penny for future education. She was happy that she could safely leave her younger siblings at home. Paul and Judy felt sorry for their older sister and tried to help with everything around the house while she was at work. The local hooligans, who knew Paul, would never have believed that he could cook, feed his younger sister, read to her, and put her to bed at night when Rosie was working. Only his sisters knew that Paul was a kind, intelligent, and responsible boy. Life had made him embittered toward people because his classmates laughed at and mocked him, calling him a beggar. Teenagers, spoiled by parental love and care, often taunted him, saying things like, "Mom is going to throw out my old stuff today. Maybe I should carry it for you." Those standing nearby would support the joker, and everyone would laugh together. In those moments, Paul would rush at the bullies with his fists, only to find himself inevitably in the principal's office, listening to another lecture. Helen rarely went to school to address these issues. Instead, everything fell to Rosie. The principal would lecture for hours, saying, "Well, Rosie, influence your brother. Look at you. "What a smart girl you are, but your brother is just a little bandit. With such behavior, he could end up in jail," the principal would say. Every time, Rosie promised to talk to her brother. She would return home from school and tearfully beg Paul, "I'm begging you. Don't get into fights anymore. They won't even let you into school later." Meanwhile, the time before the birth was growing shorter, and Rosie was becoming increasingly worried. Her mother had not struggled so much during the previous pregnancies as she did with the twins. It seemed that the years were taking their toll. One day, Rosie rushed to the office where her mother, Helen, worked. Upon opening the door, she saw her mother writhing in pain on a visitor's chair in the reception hall. The director, as white as a ghost, was muttering anxiously, "Where are the doctors?" "Helen, hold on. I beg you." He turned to Rosie, "Sit with your mother now. The ambulance is on its way. I've called them." The paramedics arrived a few minutes later and took Helen to the hospital. The next morning, when Rosie rushed to the maternity hospital, she was informed that her mother had died from a heart attack. However, thanks to a cesarean section, 2 beautiful boys had been born and saved. This news was like a sharp knife to Rosie's heart. She didn't faint only because the doctor managed to quickly catch her by the arm and sit her down on the couch next to him. He continued talking about the baby's weight and height and when she could pick them up and bury Helen. But Rosie heard it all as if from a distance. She silently stood up and left. Rosie sat on a bench in the park in front of the maternity hospital, covering her face with her hands and crying bitterly. She didn't know how to go on living, how to cope with all this grief. Rosie lost track of time, not remembering the following days clearly. Taking care of her brother and sister, organizing the funeral, everything felt like a terrible dream. The neighbors helped a lot, feeling sorry for the poor girl, and her mother's boss brought her some money. There were only 10 people at the funeral, 3 of whom were Rosie, Paul, and Judy, who didn't stop crying. When it was all over, Rosie begged the director to take the place of her mother since she was now the only breadwinner in the family. The girl worked around the clock, mopping floors for 12 hours a day, then washing and cooking for the younger ones until midnight. Luckily, the school was behind her. One evening, returning home, she found the apartment empty. None of the children were at home. Rosie's heart pounded with a terrible premonition. She rushed out onto the street, hoping they were nearby, though she knew they would never leave the house at this time without her permission. Exhausted, Rosie found a bench by the entrance, tears streaming down her cheeks. She was about to go to the police when her neighbor from across the hall, Mrs. Harriman, sat down next to her. Mrs. Harriman had been Rosie's first teacher and often greeted her with pastries when the kids were home alone. "Rosie, the children were taken away by child welfare authorities," Mrs. Harriman said gently. "The neighbors complained that the mother died and you're not home all day. The representative said the children were left to themselves. You're already an adult, and they'll all be sent to an orphanage." Rosie's heart sank. "I'll still take them all back," she insisted, but Mrs. Harriman calmly advised her, "My dear, you should go study now. They won't give them back to you at this moment, but if you study hard and get a good job, then you can take them back." Rosie spent several hours at her neighbor's place, crying and calming down. When she returned home, she didn't sleep all night, thinking about Mrs. Harriman's words. By morning, she had made up her mind to pursue her dream of becoming a stewardess. She packed her modest belongings and went to say goodbye to her kind neighbor. "Thank you, Mrs. Harriman, for supporting me and advising me on what to do," Rosie said, hugging her. "I've decided to fulfill my dream and become a stewardess because then I can take my kids back." Mrs. Harriman asked her to wait and went to the kitchen. When she returned a few minutes later, she handed Rosie a package and a note. "Here, I baked some pies that'll be helpful for you on the road," she said with a smile. "And there's also a phone number and address of my good old classmate. She lives in the city where you'll be studying. For the first few days, you can stay with her. I'll call her today and let her know about you. She lives alone in a spacious apartment. Her husband died many years ago. I think she'll be happy to take in such a smart girl." They hugged each other goodbye, and Rosie set out to start her new, independent life. Of course, it was scary for her to be alone in a big, unfamiliar city, but the dream of becoming a stewardess gave her strength. Rosie went to the address given by Mrs. Harriman and was greeted at the door by a small, thin old lady. "Good afternoon," Rosie began timidly. "Mrs. Harriman gave me your address." The hostess smiled kindly, opening the door wider and inviting her in. "Yes, my old friend called me yesterday and sent me a modest and beautiful girl. I see she didn't disappoint. Come in, don't be shy. Otherwise, I'll go crazy here alone. Let me show you your room right away." Upon entering the apartment, Rosie tried to explain, "I'm only here for a day. Then I'll go to the dormitory or rent an apartment." The woman looked at her, surprised. "Are you crazy? A hostel or a rented apartment?" If Mrs. Harriman asked me for someone, it meant that person was worth it. "I live alone, and my only son lives very far away, so I'm pleased that Mrs. Harriman sent me such a good neighbor." Rosie reached into her small, worn-out vintage shoulder bag and pulled out neatly folded bills from its depths. She handed them to the elderly woman, saying timidly, "Here, this is all I have. Let me just rent a room at your place. It's not much, but I'll compensate once I start earning." Despite being a tiny elderly woman in her 70s, Mrs. Gibson had a mischievous spirit at heart. She took the bills, squinted as if examining the denominations, then returned them to Rosie's bag, placing it back on her shoulder. She looked at the bewildered Rosie and said playfully, "This money will come in handy for you in the city for a couple of days. Let's make a deal. You won't pay me anything for the first 3 or 4 months. Once you start working, you can pay me then." Mrs. Gibson showed Rosie to a small but cozy room, which was her son's. It was adorned with sports medals, certificates, and trophies. Seeing Rosie's confusion, Mrs. Gibson said with a hint of sadness, "My son rarely visits me, but I want his room to feel lived in. I've made the bed, and there's plenty of space in the closet. You can stay here as long as you need to. If his awards are in the way, I can move them to my room." He was into swimming and always came back with awards. That evening, they sat in the kitchen for over 2 hours. "You're smart. You'll learn everything and then get your brothers and sisters back. But for now, focus on your studies," Mrs. Gibson advised. The next day, Rosie went straight to the airport because she didn't know where to study to become a flight attendant. To her surprise, there was an announcement for flight attendant recruitment at the entrance. After carefully studying all the requirements listed in the announcement, she was almost certain that she would make it. She did. Rosie passed all the necessary tests, checks, and medical examinations with ease. She flew back to Mrs. Gibson on wings. "I've enrolled. I'm going to be a flight attendant," Rosie shouted, kicking off her shoes and walking with a graceful stride, leaning over imaginary passengers and speaking to them with a captivating smile. Mrs. Gibson, who had come out of the kitchen at Rosie's call, put her hands on her chest and laughed happily, watching this improvised scene. When Rosie reached the end of the hallway, she happily plopped onto a chair. Mrs. Gibson said, "Good for you. I never doubted it. You're a natural-born flight attendant. Everything will be wonderful for you. I'm sure of it. I knew you'd come with good news, so I baked your favorite cheesecake," Mrs. Gibson said with a smile. "I can't forget the story about the piece of cake that Mrs. Harriman brought to you, and you only managed to have a teaspoon. Now you have every right to eat it all yourself." Rosie had indeed tasted that seemingly airy and incredibly delicious dessert only once. Mrs. Harriman had treated her to a piece of cheesecake for her birthday, but at home, she had seen how much her younger brother and sister enjoyed the treat. Rosie had allowed herself only a couple of small bites, no bigger than a walnut. Several years had passed, but the taste remained unforgettable for her. Now she could eat an entire cake standing on the table, but instead of joy, tears filled her eyes. Mrs. Gibson immediately understood what Rosie was thinking. She took Rosie's hand and said softly, "Don't worry, dear. You will get your siblings back once you stand on your own 2 feet. And I'll bake a big cheesecake for each of you. For now, you're with me, and you're an incredibly intelligent person who has achieved her goal. You can indulge in the treat." That evening, they once again stayed up late in the kitchen. Rosie excitedly recounted how her testing had gone and how everything had been explained to her about her future, long-awaited profession. She was the happiest person on earth. For the first time in years, she had beautiful, vivid dreams at night. In them, she was on board a huge liner, looking out the windows at the lights of a big city. She wore the same outfit as the girls in the picture. Every morning for several months, Rosie woke up a couple of hours earlier than usual and quickly got ready for her walk to school. She loved these morning walks, which gave her a great mood and a boost of energy for the whole day. To be honest, Rosie tried to save her already meager savings and avoided using public transport. Studying at the courses was enjoyable for her. The group consisted of only 15 people, and all the teachers immediately noticed the smart, open, and charming girl. They were amazed at how easily a single, poorly dressed student from the countryside could grasp everything on the fly. After completing the courses, Rosie was immediately hired by the airline as the best graduate. Soon, her heart pounded with excitement as she climbed up the steps of the plane for the first time. The flight was not very long, only an hour one way, but for someone who had dreamed of seeing clouds from the other side all her life, it passed in a moment. She didn't even realize how quickly she was already back in her city. At home, Rosie enthusiastically told Mrs. Gibson about her impressions. "You can't imagine how beautiful everything looks from out there. It's just a pity that I couldn't press my face against the window and enjoy it all. And the passengers are all so serious. The crew is just wonderful. They're all a bit older, but that's probably a good thing. They take care of me so much." As if waking up from my happiness, Rosie became sad and added, "Now the main thing is to earn money faster to rent an apartment and take my brothers and sister with me." Mrs. Gibson sighed and replied, "Everything will work out for you. See how well it's already going. For now, enough talking, you must be hungry." "I boiled potatoes and fried cutlets," Mrs. Gibson said. "Go take off your uniform and let it wait for the next flight. Let's have dinner." Rosie looked at her uniform as if it were a favorite toy she didn't want to part with. Mrs. Gibson laughed and jokingly scolded her, "Are you going to sleep in this beautiful uniform? Go and take it off. No one will steal it." As much as Rosie wanted to stay beautiful for as long as possible, she had to put on her simple old dress again. She carefully hung her uniform in the closet, with a wild desire to put it back on again soon. For the first few months, Rosie flew on short flights. But once her internship was over, she began to be sent to distant cities. On one of these distant flights, a young, handsome man called out to her. She had seen him before. He often flew on this route. The passenger was probably a businessman, looking about 35 years old, always in a suit, clean-shaven, with a light, very becoming tan. Rosie didn't know much about brand-name items, but the watch and briefcase the stranger carried were similar to those she had seen in expensive magazines left by passengers on the plane. She remembered the man because he had flown with her for several flights in a row. Throughout the entire journey, he tried to catch her eye. When he succeeded, he smiled so radiantly that Rosie felt embarrassed and immediately looked away. Her colleague, the cheerful and carefree Miranda, who witnessed one of these moments, whispered, "Oh, he's flying again and looking at you as if he's going to take you straight from the plane to the wedding. I think he only flies this route for you. I accidentally saw him staring at you at the airport. I wish my handsome man would look at me like that." Rosie approached the man who had called her over. "Excuse me?" "For God's sake," he began quietly. "Do you have any medication for heart pain?" Rosie was momentarily thrown off. The man didn't look sick. On the contrary, his short-sleeved shirt revealed well-defined muscles, and his face had a healthy color. But the girl was scared. Anything could happen. "Just a moment, please," she said. "I'll bring the first aid kit and let me help you recline a bit." She reached for the backrest, but her wrist was easily grabbed by a strong male hand. "I don't think you have the right medicine in your first aid kit," the stranger whispered. "Is it possible to cure the heart of unrequited love?" Rosie was taken aback, her heart racing. She blushed but didn't pull away. Sensing her agitation, the passenger continued, "But there is one way to save me from imminent death. Agree to go out with me." Today I promise to behave very humbly, Damon said with a playful grin. Rosie looked at him and realized she wanted to go on this date. She found him attractive. Gathering her courage, she gently freed her wrist and, smiling quietly, said, "I'll think about it." The man's face lit up. "My name is Damon, and I'll wait for you as long as it takes. Starting right now, I'll wait after the flight because if a woman says she'll think about it, it means she hasn't said no." For the rest of the journey, Damon never took his eyes off Rosie, which made her very uncomfortable. Rosie wanted to go on this date, but she was also afraid. She had no idea how to behave with a man alone. Everything she knew about relationships came from romantic books borrowed from the library and sentimental TV shows she occasionally watched. After the flight, Rosie and the crew went to the airport building to fill out all the necessary post-flight documents and head home. Miranda was the first to spot Damon. She touched Rosie's elbow and nodded enthusiastically toward him, whispering, "Look, Rosie, you seem to have won a millionaire. That must cost a fortune." In the center of the hall, right in their path, stood Damon with a huge bouquet of beautiful velvet roses. It was hard to count the number of flowers, but it was clear there were no fewer than 100. The man approached Rosie and, as always, with a charming smile, said, "I am pleased to see you again. Of course, this bouquet can't compare to your beauty, but I promise to find and give you a diamond worthy of such beauty soon." Miranda stood with her mouth open as if all this were meant for her. Rosie, on the other hand, took the flowers and said barely audibly, "Thank you very much. They're stunning." The crew commander, the oldest in the team, approached Miranda and, taking her by the arm, said, "Are you heading to the exit? Go with us. We'll see you off. Rosie will figure it out on her own." The colleagues waved goodbye to Rosie and headed toward the exit. Damon, noticing Rosie's flustered state, suggested, "Let me drive you home first. You must be tired. But in the evening, you'll promise me a date. We'll go to a beautiful little restaurant." Damon had a car in the airport parking lot. Rosie didn't know much about car brands, but it was an expensive one. In the sunlight, the Black Beauty sparkled as if it had just come out of the showroom. On the way, Damon told her that he had been briefly married once, but the marriage fell apart allegedly because of his wife's infidelity. He owned a furniture manufacturing company in the city, inherited from his parents, which had been thriving for many years. It was the business trips that took Damon to other cities, where he concluded new contracts. After dropping Rosie off at home, they agreed he would wait for her at the entrance at 6 in the evening. Rosie felt a flutter of excitement and couldn't wait for the evening to come, even though it was only 10 in the morning. When she opened the door to her apartment, Mrs. Gibson was already waiting in the hallway. "Welcome back, Rosie," the old woman said kindly, smiling. "I see your gentleman brought you home, and what flowers. Did he rob a store?" Rosie struggled to bring the bouquet into the room and placed it on the table. "Oh, Mrs. Gibson, I've never had anything like this happen to me before. This is a passenger who often flies with me. He's been looking at me for a long time, and then he spoke up. He's so handsome that it takes my breath away." Mrs. Gibson observed the flowers and said, "Oh, my dear, you've fallen in love. Be careful, these handsome men promise a lot and then break your heart." Rosie immediately flared up in defense of Damon. "Why do you say that?" she said almost in tears. "You don't know him, and neither do I yet, but I feel that he's not like that." "Well, all right," Mrs. Gibson said, softening. "As they say, we'll see. You rest now, you're probably tired, and I'll go for a walk to my neighbor's." With difficulty waiting for the evening, Rosie put on the only dress she had bought with her first paycheck. It fit perfectly on her slender figure. She ran, like a schoolgirl on her first date, and listened with a pounding heart as Damon joked and told funny stories all the way. It was incredibly pleasant to be with him, and she laughed heartily at every joke he made. Rosie felt as though she had known him forever, and with each passing minute, he felt closer and closer. Damon brought Rosie to a small but very cozy restaurant. At the entrance, they were greeted by Damon's friend, the owner of the place. "Hello, dear guests," the man said, first kissing Rosie's hand. "Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Henry, a devoted friend of this gentleman. Damon whispered in my ear about the goddess he had met flying at bird height, but I couldn't even imagine you'd be so beautiful. I'm happily married, so I can only admire your beauty from a distance. Rosie blushed, feeling embarrassed. No one has ever complimented me so much. Thank you very much. Henry led them into the restaurant, where a beautiful melody played in a private room with a table set for two in the center. Why just one table and no other visitors? Rosie asked in surprise. This evening, the music and this room are just for you. My heart seems to belong to you forever, Damon replied. Rosie was thrilled. Everything felt like a scene from one of the novels she had read. They spent a wonderful evening talking, getting to know each other better, dancing, and enjoying themselves. Rosie's head was spinning, not from champagne but from happiness. Damon escorted her home, and she was pleased he didn't rush things, wanting the unforgettable evening to end just as it was. The next morning, Rosie woke up with a smile, remembering their date. Mrs. Gibson knocked on the door, smiling mysteriously. While you were sleeping, someone remembered you and sent something nice. Go to the kitchen and take a look. At this rate, we'll need to open a flower shop soon. Rosie leaped out of bed and ran to the kitchen in her nightgown. There, she found a huge basket of flowers and an envelope. She opened it quickly, squealing with delight as she read the contents. She held the postcard close to her chest, humming cheerfully and spinning around the kitchen with closed eyes and a happy smile. Mrs. Gibson's voice brought her back to reality. Go change your clothes. What if the prince comes? Rosie went to her room, clutching the postcard to her chest. She was relieved after their date. She had worried that Damon, despite his tender farewell, might not want to see a simple girl from the province again, especially with her challenging family background. Rosie had feared that Damon, being so smart, handsome, and successful, would be easily disappointed by her story. But after reading the postcard, where Damon confessed his love once again and invited her on another date, Rosie was over the moon. She was now sure that Damon was truly in love with her, and she realized she was head over heels in love with him too. Damon wrote that he would wait for her at the entrance at noon, and Rosie couldn't sit still for the rest of the time. 5 minutes before the appointed time, Rosie dashed out onto the street where a familiar car was waiting. Damon stepped out to meet her, taking her hand. Let's go quickly. I have a surprise for you. I think you'll like it. In half an hour, they arrived at a sturdy wooden building in front of a fenced field. Well, here we are, Damon smiled. Let me show you something. Hand in hand, they approached one of the buildings. Rosie gasped with delight. It's a stable. The dream of my life. How did you know? Damon looked at Rosie with a mysterious smile. In my experience, all princesses love to ride horses. I'm sure you'll love it too. Rosie quickly learned to handle the perfectly white stallion assigned to her. In just under an hour, she was happily galloping around the circle, confidently holding onto the saddle. When the ride ended, Rosie kissed Damon on the cheek, her cheeks flushed. Thank you so much. I've only seen horses on TV before. This is unforgettable. I'll remember this day for the rest of my life. Why remember it for just a day? Damon whispered gently, pulling her close. We can come here every weekend if you like. He kissed her, and Rosie felt overwhelmed by her emotions. They spent the rest of the day and night together in a beautiful hotel on the lake. A romantic candlelit dinner was set in a gazebo above the water, followed by a bed strewn with rose petals and heartfelt love confessions. From that day on, Rosie and Damon began dating. He often met her after her flights, showered her with expensive gifts, and took her to the city's most fashionable restaurants. Despite the whirlwind romance, Rosie never wondered why Damon, despite having a large apartment, never invited her there. One day, Mrs. Gibson, who had never interfered in Rosie's life before, asked, I don't understand. If you're so in love, why hasn't he proposed yet? He's not married, is he? Rosie responded with indignation. What are you talking about? He spends so much time with me and spends a lot of money. He just has a lot of work right now. As soon as he deals with it, he'll take me with him. Maybe we'll even get married. Mrs. Gibson shook her head, unconvinced. If he truly loves you, he wouldn't want to be apart from you, even for a moment. At that moment, Rosie was too happy to argue. One day, she started feeling nauseous and had a strong reaction to certain smells. Remembering how her late mother had experienced the same symptoms, she went to the doctor and found out she was pregnant. Rosie was ecstatic, thinking of the happiness of having a child with her beloved. She rushed to share the news with Damon, imagining a joyful, movie-like reaction. However, his response was cold and unexpected. I hope you're not thinking of having the baby just to continue the cycle of poverty like your mother. I don't need this child at all. The words hit Rosie like a thunderbolt. She was sitting on the hotel bed where they usually met, and the shock almost made her faint. She couldn't believe that the man she loved was speaking to her with such detachment and cruelty. Damon continued, "Did you think I'd tie my life to someone like you? You're just my entertainment, a temporary fling. I'll marry someone worthy, a fiancé from a well-known, noble family with a good dowry, including 2 sewing factories. We've been together for a year, and in 3 weeks, we'll be married. What do you have besides a pretty face? Your dowry consists of a bunch of siblings. I'm sorry, but I don't need that kind of wealth." He pulled out a thick stack of bills from his wallet and threw them onto the coffee table. "I think this should cover the problem. Please, don't make a scene or bother me anymore. From now on, you're on your own and I'm on my own." As soon as the door closed behind him, tears streamed down Rosie's face like a waterfall. She cried silently, feeling as though her heart had stopped beating. Desperate, she ran to the window, flung it open, and inhaled the air greedily, as if afraid of suffocating. She looked down from the 6th floor and climbed onto the windowsill, but as she tried to steady herself, her foot slipped. She fell to the floor, shaken but unharmed. At that moment, Rosie felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, God," she thought. "You saved me from a terrible mistake. I have my family. I'm going to live no matter what." To her surprise and relief, Mrs. Gibson, upon learning of the incident, didn't lecture or moralize. Instead, she gently patted Rosie's head and said, "Life is testing you again, but don't worry. We'll get through it together." They agreed never to speak of Damon again, and he stopped appearing on Rosie's flights. Rosie's morning sickness ended quickly, and she threw herself into her work with renewed energy. No one on the crew suspected her condition. She didn't know how she would manage, but she decided to leave everything to fate. In the sky, she found solace, focusing on her passengers and finding strength in her work. One day during a flight, a cry for help came from the cabin. An elderly woman was holding the head of a 7-year-old boy who was suffocating. It turned out he had asthma, and his grandmother had forgotten to bring his inhaler. Rosie, recalling everything she knew about assisting passengers in distress, immediately sprang into action. "Help, please," the elderly woman cried. "Sam, my only grandson." Rosie asked Miranda to tend to the elderly woman and quickly began to administer first aid. Her training and quick thinking gave her the strength to tackle the emergency. Rosie helped the boy with the necessary breathing exercises, calmed him down, and made sure he was seated comfortably to get more air into his lungs. She offered him a few sips of a hot drink, and gradually, his breathing returned to normal. The grandmother, tears in her eyes, thanked Rosie profusely, explaining that they had narrowly avoided a tragic fate. It turned out that the boy's father, who had been paralyzed for over a year, was a result of a horrific accident involving a minibus collision. After the incident, a grateful passenger approached Rosie, asking her to visit their home. "Please don't refuse," she pleaded. "I spoke with your colleague and learned that you're only flying back tomorrow, and you don't have any relatives in the city. Please stay with us." Unexpectedly, Rosie agreed. She felt compassion for Mrs. Clark and decided to visit briefly. In the taxi, Sam sat next to Rosie, cheerfully recounting stories about his family. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, he had been in critical condition. Sam was a bright and engaging child. He recited poems and shared his knowledge enthusiastically. Mrs. Clark, noticing Sam's behavior, gently admonished him. "Sam, enough with the nonsense. Let's give our guest a break," she said. though she was not upset. He usually doesn't act this way with strangers, but he must like you. Upon arriving at their apartment, Sam eagerly took Rosie's hand and led her toward the building. Let's go quickly. I'll introduce you to my dad. He's very nice, even though he can't walk yet. Grandma and I go to church often to ask God to help him stand up. They reached the 3rd floor of a new high-rise building, and Rosie was struck by the elegance of the apartment complex. The lobby had a concierge, and the elevators were pristine, with mirrors and artistic paintings adorning the stairwells and landings. Flowers decorated every corner. Mrs. Clark unlocked the door and called out, "Eric, we're home and we've brought a guest. We have a wonderful guest arriving. Rosie, don't be shy." At that moment, a man in a wheelchair emerged from the room, smiling broadly. "Well, finally. I've been waiting for you," he said, hugging his son, who ran to him. "So, tell me, how was your flight? And introduce me to our guests. Judging by her beautiful uniform, you must have found her in the sky." As they all entered the enormous living room, Mrs. Clark quickly recounted what had happened in the sky. With gratitude in her eyes, she added, "If it weren't for Rosie, I don't know how it would have ended." When everyone had calmed down a bit, Mrs. Clark headed to the kitchen, and Eric suggested a tour of the apartment. "Let me show you everything." "I was thrilled when I bought this place," he said. Rosie agreed, and the apartment truly amazed her. The dimensions were impressive: a large hall instead of a corridor, a living room that was as large as Mrs. Gibson's entire apartment, and a kitchen combined with a dining room. The bedrooms numbered 4. One, judging by Sam's toys and wallpaper, belonged to a child. The second was very delicate with a large bed and was a woman's room. Based on the suitcase from the plane, it belonged to Mrs. Clark. The third, according to Eric, was for guests and had minimal furniture and no personal belongings. Finally, the man opened the last door and said, "This used to be my wife's and my bedroom, but now it's my den." The room featured a large double bed, a dresser, and a built-in wardrobe with mirrored doors. Everything was in the same style and color, and it looked very beautiful. Next to the bed was a small table on wheels, filled with various medications. Then, they went to Eric's office. "This is where I work, and I work a lot," he said, somewhat embarrassed. "What do you do if it's not a secret?" Rosie asked, also embarrassed. "I'm impressed by your courage because many people in your situation give up." Eric turned to his guest and said, "I didn't come to this immediately. At first, I felt that life was over and there was panic. It seemed that everything had collapsed. My wife died, I was crippled, and my business partner turned out to be a scoundrel who betrayed me at the most difficult moment. As soon as I ended up in the intensive care unit after that terrible accident, he transferred all the money from our joint business to other accounts. Initially, when I started to recover slightly, I tried to find him, but unfortunately, it was all in vain." As Eric spoke, Rosie looked at a collage of photos on the wall. In many of the pictures, Eric was with an incredibly beautiful blonde, and both of their eyes, even in the photos, shone with happiness. There were several photos of Eric, still very young, standing in a soldier's uniform with his fellow soldiers. Since then, he hasn't changed much, except for now using a wheelchair. Suddenly, Rosie's attention was drawn to a group photo with about 10 people, men and women. She knew one person well, and there was no doubt about it. In the photo, slightly younger than now, Damon was standing. "Excuse me," Rosie said nervously. "Who are you in this photo?" the man asked, moving closer. Sadly, he replied, "These are former employees of my previous company." "Are you asking about the woman on the right of me, the darling of all the women in our office? That's the scoundrel who, taking advantage of my position, deprived me of everything I had. It's a good thing that this apartment remained. Now I'm trying to create something new, but starting alone, without money, and in such a position, is difficult." Turning to Eric, Rosie said with a hint of joy in her voice, "I think I can help you. Unfortunately, I know very well the person who betrayed you. He betrayed me too, or rather, my love. But that's not the point now. He hasn't disappeared. He usually flies on the same flight, although he has been trying to avoid me lately. He told me, by the way, that his business came from wealthy parents who died some time ago. Eric slapped his legs indignantly and almost shouted, "Well, see, parents, his grandmother raised him all his life, went out of her way to get him an education. And he, having studied, got a job with me and sent her to a nursing home. I found out about this completely accidentally, only after he betrayed me. Then he said his poor grandmother had died of a heart attack. A little later, I was very surprised when he offered to become my partners. He had money then and decided to invest it in the business. It turned out that after his grandmother's death, he sold her apartment. That was his whole capital. How did you meet and where can he be found?" Rosie asked. She apologized and said she didn't want to discuss her relationship with this person, but would gladly help find him and expose him as a fraud. They spent some time developing a plan for their next steps against the swindler. Later, Mrs. Clark called them to dinner. During dinner, Rosie felt a deep connection with everyone, even though she had only known them for a short time. Sam was constantly talking to her specifically, and Mrs. Clark took great care of her, trying to offer the best pieces from the dishes. Rosie and Eric occasionally made eye contact, and Rosie felt especially warm each time. As they parted, they promised to meet again. Mrs. Clark, noticing the glances exchanged between her son and the stewardess, was already hoping for their next meeting. She had liked Rosie from the first moment and had persuaded her to visit. Sam, clinging to Rosie's hand, wouldn't let go until she promised to visit them on her next flight. Upon returning to her city, Rosie easily tracked down her ex-lover, who continued to fly in the same direction but deliberately bought a ticket for a flight with a different crew. With his money, nothing seemed impossible, but only he thought so. Rosie managed to track him down and, upon landing, called Eric. At Damon's destination, the police arrested him. It turns out that acquiring large amounts of money does not equate to acquiring wisdom. During this time, the swindler had changed his passport, bought a small furniture factory, and planned to marry a rich bride, probably hoping to swindle his future father-in-law with the remaining money stolen from Eric. He even booked a honeymoon trip that he never took. He no longer needed any vacation packages. During the trial, the investigator discovered that, in addition to blatantly stealing his companion's money, the villain was also responsible for the terrible accident that killed Eric's wife. Upon learning this, Eric, confined to a wheelchair, was ready to crawl over and strangle the scoundrel right in the courtroom. Only Rosie, who sat next to him, was able to calm him down by taking his hand. Damon was given a considerable sentence, and Eric received a decent amount of money, which was used for a spinal cord operation. A year had passed. "Darling, darling, don't worry," Eric said lovingly. Rosie, standing at the altar on her wedding day, felt an overwhelming sense of trust, love, and respect for the person beside her. For the first time in her life, she realized that he was the one sent to her by fate. It was Eric who would stand behind her like a stone wall, not only for her, but for everyone present at the wedding in the church. Rosie turned around and barely held back her tears. Mrs. Clark and Mrs. Gibson, holding the hands of Rosie's twin brothers, stood behind her, glowing with happiness. Sam proudly rocked the stroller with the baby girl. The noticeably grown-up Paul ran back and forth between his brothers and the newborn niece, trying to help them each time. Judy stood aside, as always, ready to help at any moment but not participating in anything. When the priest proclaimed the young couple husband and wife, everyone clapped and rushed to hug the newlyweds. Mrs. Clark cried and said to the bride, "Fate sent you to us for a reason. You are our savior." Eric, still limping a little, approached and hugged his wife. "Well, my dear," he said so lovingly that Rosie was on the verge of tears, "now we will all go to our big house, where everyone will have a place." Initially, Rosie didn't pay much attention to Eric's words. However, when they arrived at a beautiful 3-story house, she looked at her husband questioningly. "I just thought," Eric began mysteriously, "that even in our huge apartment, such a family would feel cramped. So I made this arrangement. Now we will all live together here in the fresh air." Mrs. Gibson, There will be a big room for you too. Additionally, your son and grandchildren can come to visit you here, and my mom will have more fun with you. Initially, the residents of the cottage were skeptical of the noisy family. However, over time, the close-knit large family won the love and trust of everyone, from young to old. They became the largest, but also the most loving and friendly family in the district.
My name is Aurora, and at 26, I'm a driven career woman. Currently, I share a home with my husband, Marcus. Lately, I've been contemplating starting a family soon, but Marcus believes we should first focus on building a house and settling down before considering children. Therefore, we're diligently saving money for our future home. Despite my desire to start a family promptly, Marcus remains adamant about his stance. Whenever I broach the topic of children, he reiterates the need to establish our home first. It's disheartening how he disregards my perspective. I resign myself to the idea that I must work harder to contribute to our savings. Marcus and I have been married for a year now, and I've noticed a pattern in our relationship. He rarely considers my opinions, a trait that persisted from our dating days. Initially, I admired his strong conviction, but in marriage, mutual respect for each other's viewpoints is essential. I fear our marriage is faltering, especially with the influence of his parents, who live just a short drive away. Marcus frequently visits his parents, citing reasons like cutting down on expenses. However, I've discovered he indulges in drinks with his coworkers, conveniently omitting these expenses from his frugal calculations. It's perplexing how stringent he is with me about saving yet being lenient with himself. His frugality extends to trivial matters like conserving hot water and turning off lights prematurely, directives he imposes solely on me. If only he extended the same standards to himself, perhaps our relationship wouldn't feel so one-sided. I would be seething with anger, however, he seems to believe it's acceptable to impose his ideas on others. Every week when we visit his parents' house, a new problem surfaces. Hasn't it been a year since you got married? We want some good news soon. We'll be able to see our grandchild, exclaims both my in-laws, putting immense pressure on me, glancing at Marcus sitting beside me. I can tell he's glaring disapprovingly. It's evident he wants to say, "Don't say unnecessary things." While I share the desire for a child, Marcus insists on building our own home first. It's entirely inappropriate for my in-laws to pressure me to have a child in this situation. Rather than advising Marcus, who doesn't listen to my words at all regarding having children, my in-laws persist in pressuring me. Despite wanting to speak up, I'm silenced by their constant pressure for a grandchild. After the meal, Marcus announces, "I'm going out for a smoke. You know, Aurora, it seems like you're working, but if you want to be a housewife, you should quit your job and work hard to be a good wife. Maybe that's why Marcus isn't paying attention to you. It feels as though I'm being told I can't have children because I'm working, despite my strong desire for children. Just quit your job already," urges my in-law. I retort, "It was Marcus who asked me to work. Why don't you talk to Marcus first before constantly lecturing me?" Expressing my anger, I continue, "When it comes to having children, I want them too, but it's Marcus who stubbornly refuses to listen to me until we have our own home. Instead of knocking at me, why don't you make sure you tell your son the truth?" My words leave my in-laws in a state of shock. I excuse myself with a simple apology and leave the table, making my way towards the entrance. The anger within me extended to Marcus, who leisurely smoked by the entrance without saying a word. I climbed into the car, and Annie followed suit, casually remarking, "Hey, are you leaving already?" Knowing he would never disclose the truth to his parents, I grew weary of the various things my in-laws constantly told me. I declared that I wouldn't be visiting my in-laws' house anymore, and Marcus widened his eyes in surprise. Why not? We can save on food expenses, right? You also want a home soon and children, don't you? He questioned. Fed up with the continuous impositions from both him and my in-laws, I snapped back. If it's about saving, I've told you many times that we would save more if you stopped going to drinking parties or smoking instead of driving to your parents' house just to save the cost of one meal. Why don't you save in that way? Everyone needs a break. Expressing my frustration, I continued, you keep imposing things on me like not using hot water and turning off the lights by 10 p.m. You think we can save money without sacrificing anything? If I have to go through all this trouble alone, then I don't need a home. I'm fed up with this. You never sacrifice anything yourself, but you're okay with imposing it on others. He seemed to downplay the situation, saying it's not a big deal, but I countered, no, it is a big deal. How much patience do you think I've had all this time? Moreover, I was infuriated by his pretense in front of his parents, making it appear as if I were the reason we couldn't have grandchildren. I'm tired of being the only one asked to have grandchildren. It's not me who doesn't want children, it's Marcus. I've been saying it for a long time. I want children soon, so please stop being so angry. Seeing Marcus's struggle to deal with my unusual anger brought a slight sense of satisfaction, but it didn't resolve everything. Unsure of what to do next, I gazed out of the car window, ignoring Marcus. A turning point for us came a month later when one of my relatives, my father's brother, passed away. With several pieces of land, a luxurious mansion, and a lavish lifestyle, my uncle's passing became a revelation for Marcus. Impressive. I didn't know you had such a remarkable relative, he remarked a few days later upon receiving news about my uncle's inheritance. I decided to discuss the details with the lawyer in our apartment, recognizing that it was a matter exclusively related to me and had no bearing on Marcus. I politely asked him to leave the room, especially since he seemed uneasy about the concept of inheritance. I wanted to spare him any potential trouble that could arise if he got involved. After about 3 hours of listening to the lawyer explain the intricacies of the inheritance, I thanked him and asked him to leave. However, to my surprise, Marcus, who had been at home earlier, was nowhere to be found. Assuming he had probably stepped out to avoid interrupting my conversation with the lawyer, I started preparing dinner. Little did I know, 3 months later, Marcus approached me, expressing, "There's something I want to show you," and took me for a drive. Excitement welled up as we entered a residential area, but my confusion grew when the car parked in front of a certain house. Marcus then pressed the intercom, and my in-laws emerged from inside. However, it was evident that this house was not their home. "You finally made it. When are you and Aurora moving over here?" "We're thinking of moving in by the end of this month," announced my father-in-law. He continued, blaming me for being a selfish daughter-in-law and accused me of always shifting the responsibility for having children onto Marcus. I shot a disapproving glare at Marcus, bewildered as to why he brought me here when I had clearly stated I wouldn't visit my in-laws anymore. Searching for an explanation, I questioned him, and he simply shrugged, stating, "Don't get so angry. If we live together, we can bridge the gap between you and my mom. Besides, this will be our new home from now on, so you should cooperate on the children issue as well." His revelation left me in disbelief. I hadn't agreed to living with them, especially after explicitly stating that I wouldn't go to my in-laws' house anymore. The situation was further complicated by the nature of the house. As Marcus disclosed, it's a two-family house. My plan was always for us to live with my parents eventually, so what's the problem with living in a two-family house now? The question lingered in the air as I mulled over the situation. Living in a two-family house seemed to be a significant issue, especially when considering our savings. According to our financial situation, building such a splendid new house was seemingly impossible. I couldn't fathom how Marcus managed it. My dad and I chipped in the money, so our savings are empty, but it's fine, right? Marcus casually mentioned. His nonchalant attitude perplexed me. He continued, I heard your uncle's inheritance was worth $690,000, so if he used that money to repay us for the cost of the two-family house, it should be fine, huh? I was taken aback. The idea that he believed my inheritance should be used to fund the house without my consent baffled me. Even if I were to inherit the money, how I used it should be my decision, not his. Frustrated by my rejection of their proposal, Marcus reached into his bag and pulled out a pre-filled divorce form with his name on it. Your money is our money. If you don't like living together, then let's get a divorce, he declared. I took the divorce form from his hand, expressing, fine. If living together is the alternative, then divorce is the better choice. Firmly placing the divorce form into my bag, I turned my back on him and my in-laws, who looked stunned. Ignoring their reactions, I continued, by the way, I renounced my uncle's inheritance. Marcus froze with a bewildered expression. Without waiting for a response, I took a bus and headed home to our apartment. Upon arrival, I promptly filled in my name on the divorce form, which already had Marcus's name on it. I then submitted the divorce papers and immediately purchased cardboard boxes at a home improvement store to start preparing for the move. Recognizing that I couldn't handle the move alone, I hired a moving company. Fortunately, it turned out that not many moves were happening during this season, allowing for a quick relocation. As I packed for the move, a commotion outside the front door indicated Marcus's return. I had the chain lock on, and I addressed him, sorry, I had the chain lock on. I don't know what you might do when you're so angry. Besides, I need to finish packing for the move. Could you stay at your parents' house for a few days? I won't accept a divorce, Marcus declared, widening my eyes in surprise. I reminded him, but you handed me the divorce form, didn't you? If you sign the divorce papers, that means you agree to the divorce, you know. Astonished, I questioned whether he truly understood the implications of what he had done. He frowned, appearing frustrated, but quickly changed the subject. Why would you give up on a $690,000 inheritance? Normally, you'd inherit it, he questioned. It seemed he had overheard some details about the inheritance but hadn't grasped the full story, likely after learning about the $690,000 inheritance. He had rushed to my in-laws, and they impulsively purchased the two-family house without considering the consequences. I explained, the inheritance discussion came to me because there wasn't anyone else to inherit it. My uncle had 3 sons, 2 daughters, a wife, and grandchildren. However, all of them renounced the inheritance, so it ended up coming to me. My uncle did have $690,000, but he had to demolish his mansion, spend a lot on maintaining his land, and had plenty of debt. I realized that renouncing the inheritance was a better choice than inheriting it. Marcus was in disbelief, exclaiming, no way. So even if you had inherited $690,000, you're saying there wouldn't have been much money left? That's fraud. I explained that the lawyer and I had a proper discussion about it, but someone had eavesdropped and left before hearing the whole story. My words left him speechless, and perhaps he finally realized he was in the wrong. However, I asserted, it's too late now. You betrayed my trust. We've already filed for divorce, and you and I are no longer a couple. Why are you simply saying you don't want to divorce now? If you truly didn't want to divorce, you should have followed me right away when I left, shouldn't you? I reminded him of the consequences of his actions, emphasizing that his mother's opinion about the divorce didn't change the fact that he and his father had invested in the two-family house. His mother's lack of experience with work didn't allow her to fully appreciate the value of money. I sighed, realizing it wasn't my role to listen to his complaints about his parents. If we were still a married couple, I might have entertained the conversation. However, I reminded him, you haven't submitted the divorce papers yet, have you? He pleaded, if you do it now, we can still be a couple. Please, let's live together in that two-family house. I'd already submitted the divorce papers, so it's pointless now, I replied. His expression slumped in front of the apartment door, appearing bewildered and lost. While I believed he brought this upon himself, I couldn't let him linger outside forever. Briefly considering sending him away, I realized I had no time to waste, so I continued with my preparations for the move. After a while, he was gone, and I proceeded with the move. Informing my workplace about the divorce, especially since my boss had acted as our mediator, felt obligated to apologize for the divorce. I'd also shared the news with my coworkers who had been invited to our wedding. During lunch break, unexpectedly, he burst into my department in front of my coworkers, claiming, "It's absurd that you're talking about the divorce. I wish you hadn't mentioned it." He disclosed the situation in his department, assuming I had inherited an estate and suggested buying a two-family house. When faced with the choice between divorce or living together, I chose divorce. Consequently, he found himself being avoided by everyone. I even received sympathy from colleagues. Eventually, he quit his job. During this time, a male colleague confessed to me, saying, "I've actually liked you for a long time. I hope to build a home where we can communicate as a couple and work things out together. Thank you for being with us and listening until the end. If you found it interesting, please subscribe, give us a like, and leave your comments. We'll see you on the Retaliation Realm channel.